The city was buzzing, as it always did. But Donald Trump sat quietly in his office, staring at the glowing screen in front of him. He had just finished reading the morning news. Another story about rising tensions between the police and the public. Another protest. Another argument. The constant friction between the rich and the poor. Trump leaned back in his chair, a sigh escaping his lips. He was used to the limelight, the constant cameras and microphones, the praise and the criticism. But recently, something felt off. He was tired of being judged by what others thought of him, tired of his life being nothing more than a headline. And more than anything, he was tired of feeling disconnected from the world outside his gold-plated walls. "What if I could see the world through their eyes?" he muttered to himself. "What if I could walk in their shoes for a day?" The thought stuck with him. It was a challenge, a test of sorts. What if he could experience life as the people did who were often ignored, dismissed, or worse, vilified? What if he could get a first-hand look at how the system treated those who had nothing, those who lived on the margins? What if he could walk among them, disguised, and see how the police, the system, even the public, reacted to someone who wasn't wearing a suit and tie? His mind raced. The disguise. It was genius. He knew it wouldn't be easy, but it was the perfect solution. He was no stranger to putting on a facade when needed, whether in business or in politics, but this would be different. This was about challenging perceptions, pushing boundaries, and maybe, just maybe, uncovering truth that had been hidden beneath the surface. Trump rose from his desk and walked over to the window, gazing out at the sprawling skyline of New York City. The city that never slept. The city that had made him who he was. But today, it felt distant, almost foreign. He thought about how the city looked to someone who didn't have the luxury of wealth, power, or influence. The homeless, the neglected, the ones who struggled just to make it through the day. How did they see the world? How did they see him? That was it. He had to know. He had to experience it for himself. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough? Trump began to make calls. He reached out to his personal assistants, asking them to arrange the logistics for his experiment. A makeover. He would need a disguise, one that would help him blend in seamlessly with the homeless community. It wasn't just about the clothes. It was about creating a persona, an identity that no one would recognize. For once, he would be anonymous. By the following morning, he was ready. The transformation was incredible. His sharp, perfectly combed hair was replaced with a messy, unkempt beard and scraggly hair. The tailored suits that once made him the center of attention were replaced with threadbare, dirty clothes that smelled faintly of the streets. The confident businessman was gone. In his place stood a man who looked like he had been through hell, tired, worn, and beaten by life. For a moment, as he looked at his reflection in the mirror, Trump wondered if he had made a mistake. He barely recognized the person staring back at him. It was as though he had become someone else entirely, someone who was invisible, someone whose life didn't matter. But he shook off the doubt. This was necessary. He needed to understand what the public never saw. Stepping out of the hotel, Trump was immediately hit by the cold air of the city. The streets were filled with people hurrying to their destinations, oblivious to the man who now walked among them. He took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. This is it, he thought. This is where it begins. His first stop was a small corner store. Trump stood by the door, trying to figure out how to approach people. He hadn't expected it to be so difficult. He was used to being recognized, used to having people open doors for him. But here, on the streets, no one cared. People avoided his gaze as if he didn't exist. They walked around him, as though he were part of the scenery. It was jarring. A few minutes passed, and Trump mustered up the courage to ask a passerby for help. "Excuse me, sir, could you spare some change?" he asked, his voice quieter than usual. The man barely glanced at him. Without breaking stride, he muttered a quick "sorry" and kept walking. Trump's chest tightened. Was this what life was like for the invisible? He was used to being the center of attention, to people listening when he spoke. Now, it was as though he were a ghost. He continued his walk, his mind racing. Every few blocks, he would try to engage with someone. Another person for change, for help, or even just for a conversation. But the result was always the same. People avoided him, hurried past him, or offered nothing but a cold shoulder. It was around noon when he decided to take a break. He found a bench in a park and sat down, watching the world move around him. He could feel the tension in his chest. People didn't look at him. They didn't notice him. For the first time in years, Trump was nothing more than a face in the crowd. His phone buzzed. It was his assistant, a reminder of a meeting that was scheduled for later in the day. He quickly turned the phone off, not wanting to be reminded of his life before the disguise. This wasn't about meetings or deals. It was about something deeper, something personal. As the day wore on, Trump's frustrations began to mount. He had been expecting some level of indifference, but this was different. The world around him seemed harsh, uncaring, even cruel. It was a stark contrast to the world he knew, a world of luxury and privilege, where doors were opened at the mere mention of his name. And then, he saw them. The police. What would happen now? He had planned to encounter officers as part of his test, but seeing them approach him now, he couldn't help but feel a surge of anxiety. Would they see through his disguise? Would they treat him differently than they had treated others? Would they offer him help? Or would they see him as nothing more than a nuisance, another homeless person to be ignored or moved along? The officers slowed as they approached him. Trump's heart raced. This was it, the moment that would set everything in motion. He braced himself. Donald Trump sat motionless on the park bench, waiting for the officers to approach. His heart beat louder than usual, thumping in his chest as if trying to escape. The realization hit him hard. For the first time in years, he was vulnerable. He wasn't the businessman, the celebrity, or the powerful figure people revered or despised. He was just another man on the streets. The two officers slowly made their way toward him. They were young, probably in their late 20s, dressed in their standard uniforms, walking with the casual confidence that came with their job. Trump, despite being deep in his disguise, couldn't help but notice how they looked him over. They didn't see him as Donald Trump, former president of the United States. They didn't know he was the man whose name had once been in every headline, whose voice had been heard in every corner of the world. To them, he was just another homeless man, someone who might be in trouble, or someone they'd have to move along. He felt the weight of their gaze and knew that, in that moment, he wasn't important to them. He was insignificant. The first officer, a tall man with dark hair, stopped in front of him and looked down. "You all right, man?" he asked in a tone that suggested it was just a routine check. Trump hesitated for a moment, the words caught in his throat. For years, he had been the one asking questions, the one making demands. Now, he was the one being questioned. It was a feeling he wasn't used to. "I'm fine," Trump muttered, trying to keep his voice steady. "Just resting." The officer nodded, but there was no warmth in his response. He glanced at his partner, who was now scanning the surroundings, clearly not interested in engaging further. "All right, just stay out of the way," the officer said. "You can't block the sidewalk." Trump clenched his jaw, fighting the urge to snap back. He had expected some level of indifference, but this felt dismissive, as if he was nothing more than an obstacle, a nuisance to be ignored. As the officers walked away, Trump stared at their backs, the injustice of it all sinking in. He had wanted to see what life was like for the less fortunate, and in just a few minutes, he had his answer. The homeless were treated as invisible, as unworthy of attention or respect. The police didn't see them as people. They saw them as problems to be moved, ignored, or dismissed. The encounter left Trump unsettled, but it only fueled his determination. He had come out here to test the system, and the system had failed him. The police had dismissed him without a second thought, just as they did countless others who found themselves in the same position. But he wasn't going to let it slide. This wasn't just about him. This was about everyone who had been treated the same way, the ones who had no voice, no power, no platform. He could be that voice. He could be the one to expose how the system treated the vulnerable. The next day, Trump sat in his hotel room, a cup of coffee in front of him as he stared at the walls. His mind raced with plans, ideas, and the growing sense that this was bigger than he had anticipated. He knew he couldn't just let it end with one encounter on the street. He needed more. He pulled out his phone and dialed his personal assistant, Samantha. Samantha, Trump said, his voice sharp, I need something done. We're going to take this to the next level. Next level? She asked, clearly intrigued. Yes. I need a team. I need someone who can help me get footage of the police interactions with the homeless. And I need it to be done discreetly. Samantha paused. You're serious about this, aren't you? I've seen enough, Trump replied, his tone decisive. We need to show people what's really happening on the streets. We need to expose the system for what it is. By the end of the day, Trump had a team of private investigators and security professionals ready to assist him. They would follow him, discreetly recording the interactions with the police and anyone else he encountered on the streets. Trump was determined to get proof that would leave no doubt about the treatment of the homeless and the police's role in it. The next morning, Trump donned his disguise once again. This time, however, he was ready for a more aggressive approach. He wasn't just going to sit on the bench and be ignored. He had a plan. He started by visiting a local soup kitchen. As he walked through the doors, he was greeted by Sarah, a woman in her mid-30s who worked there. She had been helping the homeless for years, offering food, shelter, and support to those in need. She had heard of Trump but never imagined he would be here, disguised as one of the people she helped. Can I help you, sir? Sarah asked, looking at him with a kind smile. Trump looked around at the people sitting in the cramped space, some of them lost in their own world, others trying to engage in conversation. It was a stark contrast to the polished, glamorous life he once led. I'm just looking for a meal, Trump said, his voice steady, trying to blend in. He had become a master of this new identity, perfecting his role as a man with nothing. Sarah led him to a table and handed him a tray of food. She offered him a soft smile as she set it down in front of him. You can sit here, if you want. There's always room for one more. Trump nodded, trying to show gratitude, but his mind was elsewhere. This was it. He was in the heart of the system he had hoped to expose. He could feel the weight of the social divide pressing down on him. He was no longer a businessman or a politician. He was just another face in the crowd. After finishing his meal, Trump stepped back outside into the bustling streets. He needed to observe more, needed to get closer to the reality of life for the homeless. It wasn't enough to just be a passive observer. He needed to get in deeper, see how the system reacted when they thought no one was watching. He spent the next few hours walking around, blending into the crowd. He saw how people looked at him differently. Some avoided eye contact, others looked at him with pity, and a few even seemed to judge him. But he had a job to do. As the sun began to set, Trump found himself standing near a busy intersection, waiting for his next move. His phone buzzed again. It was his assistant, Samantha. It's ready, she said. The cameras are in place. Everything's set up. We can start filming tomorrow. Trump's eyes lit up. This was the moment he had been waiting for. Tomorrow, he would be ready to uncover the truth. And nothing would stop him from revealing what he had learned. The next morning, Donald Trump stood at the edge of the bustling city street, disguised as a man who had nothing. His ragged clothes hung loosely on his body, and his once sharp, confident posture had slouched under the weight of the new identity he was trying to adopt. For the first time in a long while, he felt like a stranger to the world that surrounded him. The constant hum of New York's chaos seemed distant, and yet, he was a part of it now, a hidden figure in the crowd. Everything's set, Samantha had said earlier. The cameras are hidden. You just need to keep your head down and act natural. Trump took a deep breath. This was his test, the moment where his curiosity and ambition collided. He had seen the headlines, heard the stories about how the homeless were treated, how they were ignored by the authorities, and how the system pushed them to the margins. But now, it was time to experience it for himself. Trump began walking, keeping his head low, making his way toward the heart of the city's busiest neighborhoods. His goal was simple: observe, interact, and gather evidence. But there was an unease that settled in his stomach. It wasn't just the hunger he felt or the cold in the air. It was the weight of his own purpose. He wasn't just a man trying to fit in. He was someone with power, a man who had seen the world from the top, trying to understand the world from the bottom. As he passed through the crowded streets, the usual confidence he had was nowhere to be found. People ignored him, barely sparing a glance. The normal hustle of the city continued, and Trump, though once a symbol of power, was now just another face in the crowd. The contrast was jarring, and the humiliation he felt was sharp. For the first time in years, he was truly invisible. He walked through the streets for hours, watching people, observing their behavior. He made eye contact with a few, but they quickly looked away, too lost in their own lives. No one wanted to engage with a man who looked like he was struggling. He tried to stop a few pedestrians, asking for directions, but his voice seemed to fall on deaf ears. It was almost as though the city had a collective agreement to pretend the homeless didn't exist. As he rounded a corner, he saw something that made his heart race. A group of police officers were gathered at a nearby bus stop. They were speaking to a homeless man, one who appeared to be a regular on the streets. He had a scruffy beard, worn clothes, and a weathered face. Trump watched intently, his heart pounding. This was the moment he had been waiting for. His opportunity to see how the police treated someone like him. The officers spoke briefly with the man, who appeared disoriented, stumbling over his words as he tried to explain something. Trump could see the officer's impatience grow as the conversation continued. After a few terse exchanges, one of the officers grabbed the man's arm roughly, pulling him away from the bench. "Move it, buddy," the officer snapped. "Get out of here." The homeless man tried to resist, but it was clear he didn't stand a chance. He was shoved aside, his dignity stripped in the blink of an eye. Trump felt a surge of anger rise within him. This wasn't just a man. This was a human being treated as though he were nothing. "Are you okay?" A voice broke through his thoughts, and Trump turned to see a young woman standing beside him. She was holding a cup of coffee and looked concerned. "Yeah," Trump muttered, his voice gruff. Just watching." The woman glanced at the scene with a look of pity in her eyes. "It happens all the time," she said softly. "They never help. They just push them around. It's like they're not even human to them." Trump nodded, his mind racing. He had expected something like this, but seeing it firsthand was different. He could feel the injustice in his bones. "Do you see this a lot?" he asked, his voice quieter now. "All the time," she replied. "It's heartbreaking. People like him just get shoved around. The police don't care. They just treat them like they're invisible." Trump felt a knot tighten in his chest. This was what he had been trying to understand, what he had wanted to see. But now that he had witnessed it, he wasn't sure how to process it. The world he had known, where his voice had been heard, his power undeniable, was so far removed from this. The people on the streets were voiceless, powerless, and to those who had the authority to help them, they were simply problems to be solved. His phone buzzed, pulling him from his thoughts. It was a text from Samantha. "We've got the footage. It's all there. But you need to get out of there, Trump. The cops are starting to notice you. Get back to the hotel now." Trump quickly checked the area around him. The officers were still there, talking to more people, but his disguise was beginning to wear thin. The police were starting to glance his way, as if something about him was off. He took a deep breath and started walking briskly in the opposite direction. His heart pounded, but he kept his head down, blending into the crowd as best he could. When he finally returned to the hotel room, he could barely contain his thoughts. The footage was already being reviewed, and Trump sat in silence as he watched the video clips unfold on the screen. The footage was shocking. It showed the police officers' treatment of the homeless, the way they dismissed them, the way they used their power to push people around with little regard for their humanity. It was all there, unfiltered, raw, and undeniable. Trump leaned forward, his fingers drumming on the desk. This wasn't just about a few bad interactions. This was systemic. This was how the homeless were treated every day. The footage wasn't just damning. It was a revelation. But there was something else. Something that gnawed at him. The realization slowly dawned on him. The officers had never questioned him. They had never asked who he was or why he was there. They had treated him like anyone else on the streets. In a strange way, his disguise had worked too well. Trump sat back in his chair, staring at the screen, a new understanding forming in his mind. This wasn't just about the police. It wasn't just about exposing their actions. It was about showing the world how easily the system overlooked people like him. He wasn't just an outsider looking in anymore. He had become a part of that system, a man whose voice could easily be ignored, a man who had witnessed firsthand how the most vulnerable in society were treated. His mission had taken on new significance now. He wasn't just testing the police anymore. He was standing up for the forgotten, the voiceless, and the invisible. He had to do something about it. The next steps were clear. But he knew one thing for sure. The world would never be the same once this was all exposed. Donald Trump had never been one to shy away from controversy. In fact, he often thrived in it. But now, as he sat in the hotel room, watching the footage over and over, a new sense of urgency consumed him. This wasn't just about stirring up headlines. This was bigger. This was a chance to make a difference. A real difference. His fingers hovered over the keyboard as he reviewed the raw footage. The camera had captured everything. The dismissive attitude of the officers, the rough treatment of the homeless man, the coldness in their eyes. Trump could almost feel the injustice radiating off the screen. He wasn't going to sit back and watch it happen anymore. The world needed to see this. Needed to see how the homeless were being treated. Needed to see how the police operated when they thought no one was watching. He had the footage, and now he had to make sure it reached the right audience. Trump's phone buzzed again, pulling him from his thoughts. It was Samantha. "We've got the contacts ready for the release. But are you sure about this? This could get ugly." Trump read the message and leaned back in his chair, his thoughts swirling. The risks were clear. Exposing the police in this way would undoubtedly cause a firestorm. There would be outrage, backlash, and even potential legal consequences. But he wasn't afraid. He'd faced firestorms before. This was a different kind of fight, one that could change everything for the forgotten and voiceless. "Do it," Trump typed back. "Release the footage. The world needs to see it." Within hours, the video went viral. News outlets picked it up, and social media exploded with reactions. The footage of the police officers pushing the homeless man around was everywhere. Headlines screamed about the mistreatment, the coldness, the disregard for human dignity. People were angry. They were outraged. But they were also talking, discussing, sharing their own stories about how the homeless had been treated in their own cities. Some shared their personal encounters with law enforcement. Others spoke about the struggles of those who lived on the streets. But there were also those who defended the police, arguing that they were just doing their jobs, that the homeless were often disruptive, or worse, dangerous. They questioned whether this one incident could truly represent the entirety of law enforcement's relationship with the homeless. Trump watched the responses pour in, his phone buzzing with every new notification. The comments ranged from support and praise to fierce criticism. The debate was fiery, and the media was relentless. But what struck him most were the stories from ordinary people. Stories from those who had experienced the same treatment, the same cold indifference. He could see it now more clearly than ever. The divide wasn't just between the homeless and the police. It was a societal issue. People had become so detached from the reality of homelessness that they stopped seeing those affected as human beings. They were problems to be dealt with, not lives to be understood. As the day went on, Trump's phone rang again. This time, it was a journalist from a major network. "Mr. Trump," the reporter said, his voice a mix of excitement and skepticism. "We've just seen the footage you released, and I have to ask, what exactly were you hoping to achieve with this? You've exposed police behavior, but why did you choose to get involved in this issue?" Trump leaned back, rubbing his chin thoughtfully before answering. "I didn't just get involved. I became involved. For too long, people have been ignoring the problem of homelessness, pretending it doesn't exist. The police, the government, the public, we all play a part in this, and the system is broken. What I'm doing is showing the world what it looks like when we look the other way." The reporter was silent for a moment, then pressed on. "But you've also been criticized. People say this is a stunt, that you're using this situation for personal gain. How do you respond to that?" Trump didn't hesitate. "I don't care about the critics. This isn't about me. This is about the people who have been ignored, the people who are treated like trash. If I have to use my platform to give them a voice, then that's what I'll do. The truth is out now. People will decide how they feel about it, but we can't unsee what we've seen." The backlash didn't stop there. News reports continued to pour in, with people questioning Trump's motives. Was he truly concerned about homelessness, or was this another one of his high-profile stunts? Was it just an opportunity for him to generate more media attention? There was also tension within his own circle. Some of his closest allies advised him to back down, to avoid further confrontation with the police and the public. But Trump was resolute. He was used to controversy. He thrived in it. And this time, he wasn't going to back down. The next day, Trump received an unexpected visit from the police. Two officers arrived at his hotel, knocking on the door to his suite with a look of determination on their faces. Trump knew what this meant. The fallout from his video had already reached them, and now they were here, likely to confront him about what he'd done. He stood up from his desk as they entered the room. "Mr. Trump," one of the officers said, his tone formal but not unfriendly. "We need to talk." Trump looked at them, unflinching. "You've seen the video, I assume?" The officer nodded. "We have, and we're not happy about it." "Well, you shouldn't be," Trump replied. "The truth is uncomfortable, but it's the truth. You've been caught treating people like they don't matter, and now the world knows." The officers exchanged glances, but neither spoke immediately. Finally, the second officer spoke up. "We understand your point, Mr. Trump," he said, "but this is a complicated issue. You can't just look at one interaction and draw conclusions. There's more to it than what you've shown." Trump crossed his arms. "I didn't draw conclusions. I showed the world what I saw. And what I saw was a man being treated like garbage. That's not complicated." The first officer took a deep breath. "We're asking you to reconsider, Mr. Trump. There are consequences to these kinds of actions. This isn't something you can just walk away from." Trump's eyes narrowed, his voice steady. "I'm not walking away. If this is how you're going to respond, then I'm doing the right thing." As the officers left, Trump's thoughts lingered on their words. The situation was growing more tense by the hour, but he was more determined than ever. He knew this wasn't just a battle for the homeless. It was a battle to expose the truth. And once the truth was out, there was no going back. Later that night, Trump stood by the window of his hotel room, looking out at the city below. The lights of New York twinkled in the distance, a symbol of the power, wealth, and chaos that had defined his life for so long. But now, he felt more connected to the people on the streets than ever before. He had started this mission to test the system, but now it had become something more. It was a chance to change the narrative, to give a voice to the voiceless. And no matter the cost, he knew he couldn't turn back. The fallout from the video continued to spiral out of control. Donald Trump had expected controversy, but he hadn't anticipated the depth of the storm it would create. The media frenzy showed no sign of slowing down. Every major news outlet was discussing the footage, and the online world was ablaze with debate. Trump's phone constantly buzzed with notifications, people sharing their opinions, some supportive, others filled with rage. The police union issued a formal statement, defending their officers' actions and demanding an apology from Trump. Some politicians called for an investigation into how the video was obtained and whether Trump had deliberately manipulated the situation to suit his agenda. And on social media, the hashtag Justice for the Homeless trended, as both praise and criticism flooded the platforms. Trump sat at his desk in the hotel suite, watching the news unfold. His face was a study in intensity as he absorbed the chaos he had set in motion. The pressure was mounting, but there was no going back. He knew this was bigger than just exposing a few bad apples in the police force. This was about addressing a system that had long turned a blind eye to the homeless, to those who lived in the shadows of society. And he was at the center of it all, whether he liked it or not. That evening, Samantha called. "The press is going wild. They want you to come forward for an interview," she said, her voice tense. "You're the story now. Everyone wants a piece of you." Trump exhaled slowly. He had known this was coming, but the weight of the decision still loomed large. If he did an interview, he'd be forced to defend his actions, to explain his motives, and the media would twist and turn his words to fit their narrative. He'd been through this before. "Do they know what they're in for?" he asked dryly, a slight smirk tugging at the corner of his lips. "Not really," Samantha replied, "but they're pushing hard. You're the story of the hour." Trump paused, considering the options. If he didn't speak out now, the narrative would continue to spiral out of his control. But if he did, the attention would only escalate. "Set it up," he finally said. "Let's give them the interview, but on my terms." The next morning, a camera crew arrived at the hotel suite. The room was set up with a small desk, a backdrop featuring the American flag, and soft lighting. Trump stood before the cameras, adjusting his suit, as he waited for the interviewer to arrive. His mind was sharp, his resolve even sharper. This was his chance to explain himself, to take control of the narrative. The interviewer, a seasoned journalist from a major network, walked into the room. She introduced herself, shaking his hand before sitting down across from him. "Mr. Trump," she began, "you've caused quite a stir. What made you decide to release the video? What exactly were you hoping to achieve?" Trump's eyes locked onto the camera, and he leaned forward, his voice calm but firm. "I wasn't looking to stir anything up. What I did was show the world the truth, something people have been ignoring for far too long. The police are just a part of the problem. This issue goes deeper than a few rogue officers. This is about a system that has failed the most vulnerable in our society, the homeless." The interviewer nodded, pushing further. "But many critics say this is just a stunt, that you've manipulated the footage to create controversy. What do you say to them?" Trump didn't flinch. "I didn't manipulate anything. What you see in that footage is the reality of how many people are treated every day. The homeless are shoved to the side, ignored, and discarded by society. My goal is simple, to start a conversation about this. We can no longer turn a blind eye." The interviewer pressed on. "But do you think your actions could harm the police? This could result in legal consequences for the officers involved. You've put them in a tough position." Trump leaned back, his fingers interlaced in front of him. "I'm not here to protect the police. I'm here to protect the people. This isn't about one bad encounter. It's about a pattern of neglect that has to end. The police need to be held accountable, yes, but so does the system that keeps these people on the streets. That's the bigger issue." The interview continued for another 30 minutes, with Trump remaining steadfast in his stance. He spoke about his own experiences in the city, about the disparity between the rich and the poor, about how the homeless were treated as if they didn't matter. As the cameras turned off, the journalist nodded, her expression thoughtful. "You've made your point, Mr. Trump," she said. "But now comes the hard part." Back at his hotel, the fallout from the interview was swift. The footage continued to make waves online, and now, with his own words added to the mix, the controversy had reached a boiling point. Protests erupted in several cities, with groups of people marching in solidarity with the homeless, calling for police reform and greater support for the most vulnerable members of society. But not everyone was supportive. As expected, Trump was accused of grandstanding, using the homeless to further his own agenda. Some critics even suggested that he was using the issue to distract from his previous political failings. "Trump's just trying to play the hero," one analyst said on live television. "This is all about getting attention, not actually solving anything." Trump sat in his hotel room, watching the coverage with a mixture of frustration and determination. He knew the media would never let up. They would spin the story in every direction possible. But he also knew something that the critics didn't. The conversation was changing. People were talking, discussing the treatment of the homeless, and for the first time in a long while, the issue was being taken seriously. His phone rang again, pulling him from his thoughts. It was Samantha. "It's escalating," she said, her voice urgent. "The police union has threatened to sue you for defamation, and some of your supporters are already pulling back." Trump clenched his jaw. This was the moment he'd known would come. The stakes were higher than ever, and the pressure was relentless. But he wasn't about to back down now. He had opened a door, and there was no closing it. "Let them sue," he said, his voice cold. "I'll take it to court if I have to. I'm not stopping." Later that evening, Trump stood on the balcony of his suite, looking out at the glittering skyline of New York. The city that had once been his playground now seemed distant, as though it were a different world. He had come to understand something crucial in these past few days. Real change wasn't easy. It wasn't clean. It wasn't comfortable. But it was necessary. And he wasn't going to stop until the truth had been heard. As the media storm raged on, the pressure on Trump intensified. His phone rang incessantly, journalists clamoring for interviews, his allies seeking updates, and critics continuing to pile on the pressure. But amidst the chaos, Trump remained unyielding. He knew that this was more than just a momentary controversy. It was a pivotal moment in his mission to challenge the status quo. But just when things seemed to be at their peak, something unexpected happened. A phone call came that would change the course of his campaign. "Mr. Trump, you've made a lot of noise with your video," a deep voice on the other end of the line said. "I'm Lieutenant Jason Carter with the Los Angeles Police Department. I think we need to talk." Trump raised an eyebrow. The LA police? He had expected criticism from the police unions, but this felt different. He paused for a moment before responding. "Lieutenant, I'm listening," Trump replied, his voice steady. "I'll be blunt, Mr. Trump. I don't agree with everything you've done, but I think you've uncovered something that needs attention, something that we, as a police force, need to address. I've been in law enforcement for over 20 years, and I've seen things that shouldn't happen. You're right about one thing. The system is broken. I want to help you fix it." Trump's heart skipped a beat. This wasn't what he had expected at all. A police officer acknowledging the problem? This was unprecedented. "Fix it?" Trump echoed. His curiosity piqued. "How exactly?" Jason's voice lowered, as if speaking carefully. "You've got the public's attention, but you can't do this alone. The media will eat you alive. I've seen it happen before. But if we could form an alliance, if we could get more officers like me to speak out, we could actually start making real changes." Trump leaned back in his chair, considering the offer. His first instinct was to remain cautious. Could he trust this officer? Or was this some kind of trap to undermine him? But something in Jason's tone made him pause. This was no ordinary call. "I've heard whispers," Jason continued. "There are more of us who feel the same way, who know something needs to change. We're ready to take action, but we need someone like you to lead the charge." Trump was silent for a moment, the weight of the conversation settling in. He had been fighting this battle alone, facing off against both the media and the public. But with someone like Jason on his side, someone inside the system, he could take this fight to a whole new level. "All right, Lieutenant," Trump said, his voice resolute. "Let's make it happen. But it needs to be done the right way. No turning back." The next few days were a whirlwind. Trump's new alliance with Lieutenant Jason Carter set off a chain of events that no one could have predicted. Jason began reaching out to other officers who shared his views, gathering a coalition of law enforcement officers who were ready to speak out and take action. The goal was clear: expose the corruption, the mismanagement, and the systemic flaws that had plagued the police force for decades. But it wasn't just about exposing the issues. It was about proposing real solutions. And that meant walking a fine line. If they pushed too hard, the backlash from their fellow officers and the public could be disastrous. But if they didn't push hard enough, nothing would change. As the group of officers grew, so did the media attention. Trump's influence was undeniable, and it wasn't just the press that was paying attention anymore. Political leaders, activists, and even public figures who had once criticized him now reached out to offer support. The video had sparked a fire, and it was quickly spreading. One evening, as Trump prepared for yet another media appearance, Samantha pulled him aside. "We've got a problem," she said, her face tense. Trump looked at her, his expression guarded. "What now?" "It's the police unions," Samantha explained. "They're doubling down on their criticism of you. They've started organizing protests, calling for a boycott of your business ventures. They're trying to make this personal, Trump. They want to destroy your credibility." Trump clenched his fists. The police unions were powerful, and their influence reached far beyond the streets. He had expected them to fight back, but this was a full-scale attack. "Let them try," Trump replied, his voice ice-cold. "I've been through worse. They want to make it personal? Fine. But they're not going to silence me. Not now." The tension only escalated as the days wore on. Trump continued to hold firm in his position, doubling down on his message about police reform and the treatment of the homeless. Meanwhile, Jason and his fellow officers were working in the background, preparing for their own public statement. They knew the risks, but they were ready to make their voices heard. Finally, the moment came. Jason Carter, standing alongside Trump, appeared on national television. The broadcast was live, and the stakes were higher than ever. This was the moment when everything would either fall into place or spiral completely out of control. "Good evening," Jason began, his voice calm but firm. "I'm Lieutenant Jason Carter, and I've been a police officer for 20 years. I've seen things that I can't ignore anymore. I've watched as my colleagues turned a blind eye to the homeless, to the marginalized, to those who need our help the most." Trump stood beside him, nodding in agreement. "This is bigger than one officer, one city, or one incident. This is about a broken system that affects everyone, and it's time we fix it." The interview was intense, with both men facing tough questions from the press. The backlash was inevitable, but something unexpected also began to happen. People were starting to listen. That night, after the interview aired, Trump received a message from Lieutenant Carter. "We've started something, Mr. Trump. The phones are ringing off the hook. Officers are reaching out from across the country, some in support, others in anger. But this is just the beginning." Trump stared at the screen, feeling a strange sense of satisfaction. He had been right all along. The truth was out, and the system was starting to crack. But this was only the beginning. He had a long road ahead of him. The real work was just starting. He leaned back in his chair, eyes fixed on the horizon. There was no going back now. He had ignited a firestorm, and it was going to burn through everything in its path. The media storm that had begun with a single video of police officers confronting a homeless man had exploded into a full-blown national crisis. What was once a localized incident was now the talk of every major city, with debates raging on TV, social media, and in every corner of the public consciousness. Trump had ignited something far bigger than he had originally imagined, and now, the question was, how far would it go? In the days following the explosive interview with Lieutenant Jason Carter, protests surged across the country. While some of the demonstrations were focused on supporting the police officers who had been exposed, a growing movement had started calling for more significant reform, calling out the systematic issues within the law enforcement system, the treatment of the homeless, and the blatant inequalities that had long been ignored. Trump had become both a hero to some and a villain to others. He had taken a bold step in exposing the darker undercurrents of police brutality, and in doing so, had shattered the silence that had protected the system for years. But this was just the start of a much larger battle, one that would push him to the limits of his ability to withstand pressure and tests of his political prowess. Trump sat in his office late one evening, reviewing the flood of messages and calls that had come in since the interview aired. Samantha entered, holding a folder with the latest reports. "We need to talk," she said, setting the folder on the desk. "The situation is escalating. The police unions have called for a nationwide protest against you. They're planning a series of demonstrations, and they're doing everything they can to discredit you. You need to prepare yourself for the backlash." Trump didn't flinch. This was precisely what he had expected. He had never been a stranger to controversy, and he was prepared to weather the storm. But what troubled him was the growing support for the protests on the other side. "And the public?" he asked, his tone still calm, but his eyes narrowed. Samantha flipped open the folder, revealing the latest poll numbers. "You're gaining ground. Support for police reform is at an all-time high, and more people are speaking out about the homelessness crisis. People are beginning to listen, but not without a lot of noise. You've become the central figure in a fight that's much bigger than you or anyone else imagined." Trump leaned back in his chair, his fingers drumming on the desk. "This is what I wanted. People are talking about the issues that matter. Now, it's time to take control of the narrative. We have to make sure it doesn't slip away." Meanwhile, the coalition of officers that Trump had started with Lieutenant Jason Carter was slowly growing. More officers had come forward, some with first-hand accounts of misconduct, others with stories about the corruption they had witnessed during their years on the force. But there was also a growing sense of fear among some of these officers. Speaking out came with risks, personal, professional, and even physical. Yet, they felt a sense of duty to what Trump was trying to accomplish. Jason Carter, despite being one of the first to speak up, was beginning to feel the heat. His family had received threatening calls, and there were whispers of a smear campaign starting against him. Some of his colleagues were calling him a traitor, others were questioning his loyalty. But Jason remained resolute. He knew they had to take this fight beyond the streets and into the halls of power. The truth needed to be heard. A few days later, Trump sat with Samantha and Jason in the back room of his headquarters. The tension in the room was palpable. Jason had come to brief them on a crucial meeting that was taking place, one that could either make or break their movement. "There's a summit happening next week," Jason said, his voice low and serious. "It's a gathering of law enforcement officials, city leaders, activists, and community organizers. I've managed to get us a seat at the table. It's our chance to put this issue front and center and to get real reforms on the agenda." Trump leaned forward, his interest piqued. "And what's the catch?" Jason sighed, clearly tired. "The catch is that it's a minefield. Everyone will have their own agenda. The police unions will try to twist the conversation to their advantage. Some activists will want to take this in a direction that might hurt us politically. It's going to be a challenge to make sure the conversation stays focused on what's important, real change." Trump smirked. "I've handled minefields before. If anyone can turn this into an opportunity, it's me. Let's make sure we have everything ready." As the days ticked down toward the summit, Trump's campaign grew even more intense. He held interviews, appeared on podcasts, and participated in live debates with people from all sides of the issue. The media was still polarized, with some outlets praising him for starting a necessary conversation, while others viciously criticized him for putting the police in the line of fire. The protests continued to grow, and in some cities, they became more intense, leading to confrontations between demonstrators and law enforcement. The night before the summit, Trump stood at the balcony of his penthouse, looking out over the city. His reflection in the glass seemed to mirror the weight he was carrying. This wasn't just about him anymore. This was about a nation at a crossroads, a system that was slowly being exposed for its flaws, and the people who wanted change. For the first time in a while, Trump wasn't just fighting for his own survival. He was fighting for something bigger, the possibility of real change. The summit arrived, and the room was filled with high-ranking officials, community leaders, and activists. The tension in the room was thick. Trump walked in, flanked by Jason Carter and a few key supporters. The room fell silent as his presence commanded attention. There were whispers, cautious glances, but Trump didn't flinch. He was here to take control, and he knew this was his moment to lead the charge. The panel discussion began, with each side presenting their views on the issues at hand. Trump had to carefully navigate the web of opinions, criticisms, and agendas. It wasn't just about defending his video anymore. It was about taking charge of the conversation and making sure that real, substantive change was at the heart of the discussion. The breakthrough came when Trump made a bold declaration. This isn't about defending the police or defaming them. It's about making sure that the officers who serve and protect are held to the highest standards, and that those who fall through the cracks, the homeless, the marginalized, are given a voice and the support they need. We can do both. We have to do both. His words were met with a mixture of applause and resistance, but Trump could sense a shift. For the first time, the conversation was not being dominated by the usual talking points. His presence had forced a new dialogue, one that was uncomfortable but necessary. As the summit continued, it became clear that change was in the air. The conversation had started to move in the direction Trump wanted. He had taken on the storm, and for the first time, it seemed like the winds were shifting in his favor. That night, as he prepared to leave the summit, Jason walked up to Trump, a look of cautious optimism on his face. "I think we did it," Jason said. "We've got people talking. There's a chance now." Trump held up his hand. "Not yet. This is just the beginning. We've made a dent, but the real work starts now." Jason nodded. He knew Trump was right. The fight wasn't over. It had only just begun. In the aftermath of the summit, Trump could feel the full force of the storm he had set in motion. While his speech had resonated with many, especially those who had long felt ignored by the political elite, it also sparked a wave of fierce opposition. The political establishment, law enforcement unions, and even members of his own party were calling for him to step back, urging him to focus on his business empire rather than the volatile world of reform. It was the backlash he had expected, but that didn't make it any easier to navigate. Trump sat at his desk, flipping through the morning papers. The headlines were a mixed bag. Some outlets praised his leadership, calling his message of unity and reform a much-needed breath of fresh air, while others lambasted him, accusing him of sowing division and undermining law enforcement. A particularly scathing editorial from a major news outlet read, "Trump's disguise, pushing reform or playing politics. Bunch of nonsense," Trump muttered to himself as he tossed the paper aside. He had always known how to weather a storm. This was just another fight he had to win. The phone rang. It was Jason Carter. "Mr. Trump, we've got a problem," Jason said, his voice tense. "What now?" Trump asked, his fingers tapping impatiently on the desk. "The unions, specifically the National Police Officers Association, are organizing a nationwide protest. They've got rallies planned in every major city, and they're calling for a complete boycott of your businesses. It's not just about you anymore. They're targeting everything connected to you." Trump leaned back in his chair, rubbing his chin thoughtfully. This was the kind of response he'd been waiting for. It was time to step up and take control of the situation. "Let them protest," Trump said firmly. "This is exactly what I want. They're digging their own hole. The more they resist, the more people will see that something is wrong." Jason's voice softened, but there was a sense of urgency in his words. "I understand, but you need to be ready. The protests won't just be about you. They'll be about the whole issue, the homelessness, the police corruption, and the system that's failing both the officers and the communities they're supposed to protect. It's going to get ugly, and we need to be prepared to fight back." Trump's gaze turned cold, his determination growing. "I've always been ready for a fight. The question is, can they handle it when the fight gets real?" Over the next few days, the protests began to escalate. In city after city, law enforcement officers and union members gathered to rally against Trump's influence, decrying his attack on the system. They painted him as an outsider who was trying to tear down the very institutions that kept society safe. The media coverage was intense, with cameras capturing scenes of heated clashes between protesters and police. Some rallies turned violent, and images of these chaotic confrontations were broadcast to millions. Trump knew that the media was playing into the hands of his opponents. The chaos in the streets was exactly what the unions wanted. It was a way to discredit him and turn the public's anger against his message. But he wasn't going to let that happen. He called a meeting with Samantha and his closest advisors. They needed a new strategy, something bold, something that would shift the conversation away from the violence and back to the issues at the heart of his message: reform and justice for the homeless. "Here's the plan," Trump said, laying out a series of proposals. "We're going to hold a counter-rally, not in the streets, but on a national stage, televised. We're going to bring together the officers who support reform, the activists, and the community leaders. We'll show the world that we're not just talking about police brutality and homelessness, we're offering solutions." Samantha raised an eyebrow. "You think we can pull this off with all the heat you're getting right now?" Trump's eyes gleamed with confidence. "We can make it happen. The media is hungry for content. They want to see us fight. Let's give them something they can't ignore. If they want a show, we'll give them a show, but with a purpose." The next week, the counter-rally took place, and the entire nation was watching. Trump took the stage, flanked by Lieutenant Jason Carter, community activists, and a select group of officers who had decided to take a stand for change. It was a bold move, and the stakes were higher than ever. As the cameras rolled, Trump stepped up to the podium and faced the crowd. The tension in the air was palpable, the opposing sides watching closely, waiting for a misstep. "Ladies and gentlemen," Trump began, his voice strong, "what you're seeing in the streets right now isn't just about police or protesters. It's about a system that's failing both the officers who serve this country and the people they're meant to protect. We're here today not to tear down, but to build up. We're here to stand for those who have been forgotten, the homeless, the marginalized, the vulnerable." The crowd was silent, hanging on every word. "Some of you may not agree with me, but I'm not afraid of the backlash. We can't sit idly by while the system continues to fail. We need accountability for the officers who do wrong, but we also need to make sure our police officers have the training, the support, and the resources to do their jobs right. And we need to make sure the homeless are given the resources they need to turn their lives around." Trump paused, allowing his words to sink in. This isn't a one-sided issue. This is about real solutions, not rhetoric. And together, we can make real change happen. The crowd erupted into applause. The rally was a turning point. For the first time, Trump had been able to shift the conversation. He had reframed the debate from the chaos and violence in the streets to a more constructive dialogue about reform. The public began to take notice, and the media coverage, while still intense, began to reflect a more balanced view of the situation. The protesters and the police unions had been fighting in the streets, but Trump had pulled the fight into the boardroom. And that was where he was most dangerous, when the conversation was on his terms. But just as things were starting to settle into a new phase, something unexpected happened. Trump's campaign faced a new challenge, one that would test his resolve in ways he hadn't anticipated. The dust had barely settled from the nationwide rally when Trump received an unexpected call that sent a ripple through his entire operation. Samantha answered the phone with a look of concern before handing it to him. "It's from Lieutenant Jason Carter," she said, her voice tight. "Something has happened. You need to take this call." Trump's brow furrowed as he picked up the phone. Jason's voice, usually calm and collected, was shaking with urgency. "Mr. Trump, we've got a serious problem," Jason said quickly, barely pausing for breath. "One of the officers who supported us, Detective Rachel Turner, has gone missing. She was last seen leaving a meeting where we discussed upcoming strategies for the reform push. Her car was found abandoned on the outskirts of the city, and there's no sign of her anywhere." Trump stood up immediately, pacing around his office. "What do you mean, missing? Are you saying someone took her?" Jason hesitated. "We don't know yet, but the situation is looking bad. There's no sign of foul play at the moment, but we've also received some cryptic messages from an anonymous source. They're warning us to stop pushing for reform or more people will disappear." Trump felt a chill run down his spine. He had known that pushing against the power structure would have consequences, but this was a step further than he'd expected. "How long has she been missing?" Trump asked, trying to maintain his composure. "Nearly 24 hours now. The authorities are involved, but there's no word yet. And the police unions, well, they're not helping much. They're tight-lipped, and some are even suggesting she may have left on her own," Jason said, his voice laced with frustration. Trump's jaw tightened. This was no coincidence. Someone was sending a clear message, one that they hoped would shake him and the reform movement to its core. But Trump was not one to back down in the face of threats. "Get me everything you can on this. I'll handle the media," Trump said, hanging up the phone. He turned to Samantha, who was watching him closely. "What's the plan?" she asked, sensing the gravity of the situation. Trump's face hardened with resolve. "We're not backing down. In fact, this only makes me want to fight harder. If someone thinks they can intimidate us with fear, they're wrong. We'll find Rachel and expose whoever is behind this. I want every resource we have focused on getting her back. And, meanwhile, we're not letting the media or the public forget why we're doing this in the first place. We'll turn this around." Over the next few days, Trump worked relentlessly to keep the pressure on the media, pushing for the story of Rachel's disappearance to remain front and center. He held press conferences, speaking passionately about the need for reform and the bravery of those who had come forward to support the cause. But behind the scenes, things were far more tense. Jason Carter worked tirelessly with the authorities, running down every lead they could find. The investigation had turned up little, and there were conflicting reports. Some claimed to have seen Rachel near a remote area outside the city, while others insisted she had been last seen in a different part of town entirely. The deeper they dug, the murkier things became. One afternoon, as Trump sat in his office, his phone rang again. This time it was Jason, and his voice was sharp with urgency. "We've got a breakthrough," Jason said. "We've identified a source, someone who claims to know what happened to Rachel. I'm meeting them tonight, but I'm not sure what to expect. I'll keep you updated." Trump felt a knot tighten in his stomach. If this was what he thought it was, a confrontation with those who were actively trying to stop him, it could be a game changer. "Be careful, Jason," Trump warned. "We don't know who's behind this, and we can't afford to let anyone else get caught up in whatever this is. Stay safe, but get me answers. I need them now." That evening, Trump sat at his desk, the weight of the situation pressing heavily on his shoulders. He had pushed so hard for reform, but now he was faced with a reality that was darker than he had imagined. A missing officer, threats, and the very people he was fighting for were being caught in the crossfire. Suddenly, the door to his office opened, and Samantha stepped in. Her face was pale, and there was a grimness in her eyes. "Mr. Trump, we need to talk," she said, her voice low. Trump's heart skipped a beat. "What happened? Is it Jason?" Samantha shook her head. "No, but there's something you need to see." She handed him a tablet, and as he turned it on, a video began to play. It was grainy, taken from a security camera, but it was unmistakable. In the footage, a group of men in dark clothing was seen dragging someone into a van. The person they were kidnapping was Rachel Turner. Trump's hands clenched into fists as he watched the video. The men in the van wore masks, but the cold, calculated nature of the abduction was chilling. Rachel had been taken, and someone powerful was pulling the strings. Someone who was willing to do anything to stop the momentum Trump had started. "This isn't just about intimidation anymore," Trump said through gritted teeth. "This is war." Samantha nodded, her face grim. "What do we do now?" Trump stood up, his eyes steely with determination. "We fight. We don't back down. We find out who's behind this, and we expose them for everyone to see. But we also show the world that we're not afraid. We stand for what's right, and we will not be silenced." The next morning, Trump made a bold decision. He called a national address. This was no longer just about Rachel Turner's disappearance. It was about sending a message to everyone who thought they could silence him or the reform movement with fear and violence. In the address, Trump made a direct appeal to the American people. "We have uncovered a conspiracy, a deliberate effort to stop the voices calling for change. An officer who was on the front lines of this movement has been taken, and we will not rest until she is brought home. To those behind this, we will find you, and the truth will come to light." His words reverberated across the nation, sparking outrage and a renewed sense of unity among his supporters. The media, once divided, began to focus on the corruption that lay beneath the surface of the police system. The disappearance of Rachel Turner had shifted the focus entirely, forcing the public to confront the depth of the issue. Trump knew this was his moment. The storm had grown even more dangerous, but he would face it head-on. And in doing so, he would uncover not just the truth about Rachel, but the dark forces that had tried to stop him from the very beginning. The days following Trump's national address were intense. The media coverage was nonstop, with outlets from both sides of the political spectrum diving into the case of Detective Rachel Turner's disappearance. What had started as a local issue now became a nationwide mystery, with conspiracy theories swirling and calls for justice growing louder by the day. Trump's direct appeal to the American people had hit a nerve. But while the nation was focused on the disappearance, Trump had something else on his mind: the people behind it. He knew that the threat to the reform movement was much deeper than just the police unions. It was something darker, more entrenched, and more dangerous. Samantha entered Trump's office early one morning, holding a thick stack of papers. She had been working around the clock, poring over every detail of the case and the growing web of corruption surrounding it. "Mr. Trump, you need to see this," she said, laying the papers on his desk. "We've traced the money. Follow the money, they always say." Trump raised an eyebrow and leaned forward, scanning the papers. "What do you mean?" Samantha sat down across from him and began to explain. "There's a network, a covert operation involving certain high-ranking officials and businessmen who have ties to the police unions. Some of these names are familiar, people who've been involved in law enforcement for years, as well as corporate entities that have significant investments in prisons and private security firms." Trump's eyes narrowed. He had always suspected there was a larger operation at play. Now, it was beginning to take shape. The pieces were starting to connect. "So, you're telling me this is more than just a few rogue officers who don't like the heat? This is a full-blown operation?" Trump asked, his tone low but filled with determination. Samantha nodded. "Yes, they're not just trying to stop us. They're trying to maintain control over the system. These people have a stake in keeping the status quo. The more chaos there is, the more money they make. And they're not going to let some reformer come in and mess that up." Trump's fist tightened on the desk. "So, they orchestrated the whole thing. They took Rachel to send a message, and now they're using her as leverage." "Exactly," Samantha confirmed. "And we think they're working through a few key people inside your own camp, too." Trump's stomach tightened. "Inside my own camp? Who?" "We've got some suspicion about Jason Carter," Samantha said, her voice lowering. "He's been feeding some of this intel to the wrong people. His connections to these businessmen go back years. We think he might have been compromised." Trump felt a sharp pang of disbelief. Jason had been one of his most trusted allies. But as the evidence stacked up, the possibility that he had been playing both sides was undeniable. "I'll handle Jason. I need him in the room now," Trump said firmly, rising from his chair. Jason Carter arrived at Trump's office just over an hour later. The look on his face was a mixture of concern and curiosity, but there was no trace of guilt, or at least, that's what Trump wanted to believe. Jason sat down, facing Trump across the desk. "Jason," Trump said, his voice cold, "we need to talk. It's about Rachel Turner. And it's about you." Jason stiffened, clearly sensing the shift in the conversation. "Mr. Trump, I don't know what you're—" "Cut the crap, Jason," Trump interrupted, his voice sharper now. "I know you've been feeding information to the wrong people. You've been working with those behind the corruption, and I'm done playing games." Jason's face turned pale, and for a split second, Trump saw something in his eyes, fear. But it was gone as quickly as it had appeared. "I don't know what you're talking about. I'm here to help you." Trump leaned forward, locking eyes with Jason. "I have the proof, Jason. You've been taking money from the same people who orchestrated Rachel's abduction, and I'm going to make sure the world knows." Jason shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "You're making a mistake. This is bigger than you think. If you keep pushing, you'll be next. There are people out there who have already made it clear. They'll stop at nothing to keep this whole thing from unraveling." Trump's grip tightened around his desk. "You're wrong about me, Jason. I'm not someone you can intimidate. But if you're really working for them, you're out. Get out of my office. Now." Jason hesitated, his eyes darting back and forth as if searching for some way to salvage the situation. But in the end, he stood up slowly, his expression betraying the weight of the decision he knew was coming. "I'm not your enemy, Mr. Trump, but you're playing a dangerous game," Jason said, his voice quieter now. "Be careful who you trust." As Jason left the office, Trump felt a deep sense of betrayal, but he didn't have time for regrets. The stakes were too high. Rachel Turner's life hung in the balance, and there were powerful people involved now, people who would stop at nothing to keep their secrets buried. Trump, fueled by his anger and a renewed sense of purpose, decided it was time to take the fight directly to those behind the conspiracy. The next step would be risky. He would have to confront the powerful figures at the heart of this operation, the ones pulling the strings from behind the scenes. But he knew that every step he took from here on out would be a calculated risk. This wasn't just about political power anymore. It was about exposing a criminal network that had been operating in the shadows for far too long. That evening, Trump called a press conference. But this time, it wasn't just about Rachel Turner. It was about exposing the truth, even if it meant taking down some powerful enemies. "Tonight, I'm not just speaking to you as a businessman or a political leader," he began, his voice steady but resolute. "I'm speaking to you as an American who believes in justice. We've uncovered a web of corruption so vast, it's reached the highest echelons of our society. The people behind the forces trying to stop us are not just interested in maintaining control. They are criminals. And it's time the world knows who they are." The room fell silent. Trump continued, his words sharper now. "I know who you are, and I won't stop until the truth comes out. Rachel Turner is not just a casualty in this fight. She's a symbol of everything we're fighting for. We will find her. We will expose the truth. And we will dismantle the system that has allowed this to go on for far too long." The media, stunned by his directness, snapped to attention. The room was filled with questions, but Trump ignored them, his eyes locked onto the camera. "Change is coming," he said, his voice resonating with conviction. "And I won't stop until the people who have been pulling the strings are brought to justice." As the press conference ended, Trump sat back in his chair, the weight of his words settling in. He had just made himself a target, but that didn't matter. The battle for truth and reform had just begun. Trump sat in his office late into the night, the weight of the day's events hanging heavily on his shoulders. The press conference had caused a stir, and the media was already buzzing with speculation. Some called him a hero, others branded him reckless. But Trump wasn't concerned about the headlines. What mattered now was Rachel and the network of corruption that had nearly destroyed everything he was fighting for. Samantha had worked overtime to track down the mysterious figures behind the scheme. They had a few names, but no concrete proof yet. The pressure was mounting. Every move they made was under a microscope, and the longer Rachel remained missing, the more dangerous the situation became. Suddenly, the door to his office opened, and Samantha walked in, looking more serious than usual. She placed a thick folder on the desk, her face tight with urgency. "Mr. Trump," she began, her voice low, "this is bigger than we thought. We've identified the people behind Rachel's disappearance, and I'm afraid it goes all the way to the top." Trump's heart skipped a beat. "What do you mean, to the top?" he asked, his voice low but steady. Samantha opened the folder, revealing a series of documents, photographs, and names. She pointed to one name at the top of the list. "This is Charles Williams. He's the CEO of a private security company with ties to several high-ranking officials in law enforcement. His company has contracts with police departments all across the country. And the thing is, he's been funneling money into private prisons, all while pulling strings behind the scenes to keep the system in place." Trump leaned forward, scanning the documents. "So he's the one orchestrating the whole thing?" "Not just him. There's a network. Charles Williams is the key, but he's working with politicians, police unions, and businessmen who are all invested in maintaining the status quo. They don't want change. They don't want anyone digging into their operations." Rachel Turner was just a warning, a message to stop digging. Trump's jaw tightened. "We need to expose them. All of them." Samantha nodded. "That's what we've been trying to do. But Williams is a slippery one. He has connections everywhere, media outlets, law enforcement, even government agencies. If we go public with this, we'll be playing into his hands." Trump thought for a moment, his mind racing. "We're not just going to go public. We're going to force their hand. We'll hit them where it hurts, their wallets. We go after their assets, their businesses, their connections. If we can shut them down financially, we'll have them cornered. And once they're cornered, they'll have no choice but to fold." Samantha looked hesitant. "That's a dangerous move, Mr. Trump. They'll retaliate. They have the resources to make it look like you're the one responsible for all of this chaos." Trump's eyes darkened. "Then let them try. I'm not afraid of their threats, but I will make them fear us." The next morning, Trump gathered his most trusted allies for a secret meeting at his private estate. The group was small but powerful: Samantha, a few key legal advisors, and a former FBI agent who had been working with him since the start of his reform campaign. The room was tense as they discussed their next move. "We have to get Williams' company in the spotlight," Trump said, leaning forward. "Expose their contracts, their deals with private prisons. We'll bring it all to the public's attention. And once people start asking questions, the pressure will be too much for them to handle." "But they'll fight back," one of the legal advisors warned. "They have deep pockets, and they won't go down without a fight. We need something concrete. We can't just rely on speculation." Trump smiled grimly. "I know. That's why we're not just going to attack their business dealings. We're going to take away their ability to operate. We'll cut off their funding, freeze their assets, and force their hand." Samantha spoke up. "I have a contact inside the FBI. He's been feeding us information about Williams' offshore accounts. There's enough evidence to bring him down, but we need to move quickly before he catches wind of our plan." Trump nodded. "Then it's settled. We take everything we know and move fast. No hesitation. We'll put the pressure on him from every angle: legal, financial, and public." That evening, Trump's team went into action. Samantha worked with her FBI contact to secure the necessary paperwork to freeze Williams' accounts and seize his assets. Meanwhile, Trump began preparing for another press conference, one that would expose the corruption of Williams and his network. The pressure was mounting, and every decision felt like a high-stakes gamble. If they moved too quickly, they risked tipping off Williams and giving him time to cover his tracks. But if they moved too slowly, they risked losing the momentum they had built. Trump knew they didn't have much time. The longer Rachel remained missing, the more public support would dwindle. The next day, as the press conference loomed, Trump sat alone in his office, thinking through his strategy. He knew the stakes had changed. This wasn't just about reform anymore. It was about survival. The forces arrayed against him were powerful, and they would stop at nothing to protect their interests. But Trump wasn't someone who shrank from a challenge. He had faced the impossible before and come out on top. This time, it would be no different. As the hour of the press conference approached, Trump walked onto the stage with a calm, determined expression. The room was filled with reporters, cameras flashing as they waited for him to speak. He cleared his throat and stepped up to the podium, looking out at the sea of faces before him. "Good afternoon," Trump began, his voice steady but filled with conviction. "Today, I'm here to tell you that we are no longer going to sit idly by while corruption runs rampant in our system. The time for silence is over. The time for action is now." He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. Behind the scenes, a network of criminals has been operating in plain sight, profiting from the suffering of the American people. One of the key figures in this operation is Charles Williams, the CEO of a private security firm with deep ties to corrupt officials and private prisons. We've uncovered evidence of illegal activities, offshore accounts, and money laundering, and we will not rest until those responsible are held accountable. The room went silent. Reporters exchanged looks, some skeptical, others intrigued. "We've also found that Williams and his associates are behind the disappearance of Detective Rachel Turner, a brave officer who dared to speak out against the corruption that has infected our justice system. This is not just about reform anymore. This is about justice." Trump's voice rose, filled with determination. "We will find Rachel Turner. We will expose the truth. And we will dismantle the system that has allowed this corruption to flourish for far too long." As the cameras clicked and the reporters scrambled to ask questions, Trump knew that the fight had only just begun. He had made himself a target, but he also knew that nothing would stop him from bringing down the people who had dared to challenge him. The days after Trump's press conference were a whirlwind. The news was everywhere. The public was split. Some saw him as the hero of the hour, finally shining a light on the corruption that had plagued the system for years. Others called it a reckless move, a direct challenge to the people who controlled much of the country's power. But one thing was clear. The stakes had been raised, and there was no turning back. Inside his office, Trump paced back and forth, deep in thought. The pressure from the media, the public, and, most importantly, his enemies was immense. Williams and his network were no longer sitting quietly. The attacks had already begun. Anonymous threats, smear campaigns, and subtle sabotage. But Trump was undeterred. He had dealt with enemies before, and he knew that this time would be no different. He glanced at his phone, which buzzed with a new message. It was from Samantha. "We've got a lead. Williams is planning something big. We need to move fast." Trump's pulse quickened. It had been only days since the press conference, and already, Williams was on the defensive. Trump had known that the pressure would force him to act. What he didn't know was what the next move would be. He typed a quick response. "Meet me at the estate. Bring everything you have." Later that night, Trump met with Samantha and the rest of his inner circle at his private estate. The mood in the room was tense. They had been tracking Williams for days, trying to piece together the puzzle, but he was elusive, slippery, like an eel in a pool of oil. They were always one step behind, and it was starting to feel like they were running out of time. Samantha sat across from him, her face grim. "We've traced Williams to a private compound in the outskirts of the city. It's heavily guarded. No one gets in or out without him knowing. But there's a blind spot. If we can get there undetected, we can uncover what he's hiding." Trump leaned back in his chair, his expression cold. "And you're sure this is where the final pieces of the puzzle are?" "Not just the final pieces," Samantha replied. "This could be the key to everything. If we get in there, we might finally have the proof we need to bring Williams down, and maybe even find Rachel." Trump thought for a moment, then nodded. "Let's do it. But we're not going in blind. I want a full team, surveillance, backup. No room for mistakes." The next evening, Trump's team was ready. They had gathered intel on the compound, formulated a plan, and assembled a small group of trusted allies who would help infiltrate Williams' lair. The operation was high risk, but Trump was prepared to go all in. If they could get inside, they might finally uncover the truth that had eluded them for so long. As they made their way to the outskirts of the city, the tension in the air was palpable. Samantha was behind the wheel, her eyes focused on the road ahead. Trump sat in the back seat, reviewing the information they had gathered. "We can't afford to fail," Trump muttered, mostly to himself. "Too many lives are at stake. Rachel, our future, everything." Samantha glanced at him in the rearview mirror. "I know, but we've got this, Mr. Trump. We're ready." Trump's eyes narrowed. "I don't need ready. I need certainty." They arrived at the compound just after midnight, the area eerily quiet. The high stone walls were topped with razor wire, and security cameras were visible at every corner. It was a fortress, and getting in would be no easy feat, but Trump had never been one to back down from a challenge. Samantha led the team to a secluded side entrance where they could bypass the main gates. They moved swiftly, blending into the shadows as they made their way toward the building's rear. There was no turning back now. Once inside, the group split up to cover more ground. Trump was with Samantha, moving carefully through the darkened halls. The place was massive, an old mansion converted into what appeared to be a high-security headquarters. They crept through corridors, their steps muffled against the thick carpets. Every door they passed was locked, every window sealed. "This way," Samantha whispered, gesturing toward a door at the end of the hall. It was the only one that hadn't been heavily secured. They tried the handle. It was unlocked. The room inside was spacious, with large desks scattered about, papers piled high, and walls adorned with maps and plans. But it wasn't the office that drew Trump's attention. It was the safe in the back corner of the room, hidden behind a bookshelf. He stepped toward it without a word, his eyes scanning the room for any sign of a trap. "Here," he muttered, kneeling beside the safe. He quickly examined it and began working the combination. Samantha stood guard, her senses heightened. "Hurry, we don't have much time." Trump finally cracked the safe open, revealing stacks of documents and files, some marked with red stamps reading, "Top Secret." He pulled them out, scanning the first few pages. His eyes widened as he read through them. This wasn't just a corporate operation. It was an intricate, multi-layered scheme involving law enforcement, politicians, and massive financial investments in private prisons. It was exactly what they had been looking for. "We've got him," Trump said, his voice steady but filled with triumph. "This is the evidence we need. These documents will bring down their entire operation." But just as Trump was about to reach for the last few files, the sound of footsteps echoed through the hallway. Someone was coming. Samantha's eyes locked onto his. "We need to go. Now." They moved quickly, gathering the files and slipping back into the shadows. But as they rounded the corner, they encountered a guard. Without hesitation, Samantha reacted, tackling him to the ground before he could raise an alarm. Trump held his breath, his heart pounding in his chest. The guard groaned but was quickly subdued. Samantha placed a hand on his mouth, ensuring he wouldn't make a sound, and then they moved past him. They made their way to the back exit, only to be stopped once again by the sound of distant shouting. More guards were closing in, and there was no way they could get out undetected. "This way," Samantha said, pulling Trump toward a small utility door at the rear of the building. They slipped outside, disappearing into the dense trees surrounding the compound. The night air was cold, but there was no time to waste. They had what they came for, and now they had to make sure it didn't fall into the wrong hands. Back in the safety of their vehicle, Trump exhaled a long breath, his fingers gripping the documents tightly. They had done it. They had the proof. But as he looked over the files, his mind raced with one unsettling thought. What if this was only the beginning? The forces behind this conspiracy weren't just a few corrupt officials. They were a network deeply embedded in every facet of the system. Taking them down wouldn't be easy. But Trump had never been one to shy away from a fight. And now, the real battle was about to begin. The aftermath of their daring mission was both a triumph and a turning point. Trump sat at his desk late into the night, poring over the files they had secured from Williams' compound. The papers were filled with names, dates, and connections, an intricate web of corruption that spanned far beyond what they had anticipated. But as he flipped through the pages, a sinking feeling settled in his chest. This wasn't just about one man. This was about a system that had been built to protect itself at all costs. Samantha stood across from him, her arms crossed, her gaze intense. "What's the next step?" she asked, her voice steady but carrying an undercurrent of urgency. Trump leaned back in his chair, eyes fixed on the documents in front of him. "We've got enough to destroy William's empire," he said, his voice low and thoughtful. "But this goes deeper than him. This network is huge. If we attack one piece, the whole system could crumble, and we can't afford that kind of chaos right now." Samantha nodded. "We need to be strategic. If we strike too fast, they'll have time to cover their tracks. But if we wait too long, the pressure will mount, and we could lose everything." Trump tapped the stack of papers in front of him. "We need to expose them, but we need to do it in a way that shakes them to their core. Williams has connections everywhere. He'll know exactly what we're doing. We need to make it look like his move, not ours." The next morning, Trump met with his closest advisors in a private meeting. The room was filled with tension, the weight of their decisions hanging over them like a storm cloud. They had made significant progress, but the battle was far from over. "We've uncovered enough to implicate Williams and several high-ranking officials," one of Trump's legal advisors said, flipping through a tablet. "But we need more. We need something that ties them directly to the illegal operations, something that'll make the public demand accountability." Trump's eyes narrowed. "That's where the media comes in." Samantha spoke up, looking at Trump with a knowing glance. "We could leak a portion of the documents, just enough to get the media talking. If we do it right, it'll create a scandal big enough to force a government investigation. But we have to control the narrative." "Exactly," Trump replied. "We need to control the narrative from the start. The media will pick up on whatever we throw at them, but we can't let them twist the story. The moment they start focusing on something other than the corruption itself, we've lost." As the plan began to take shape, Trump realized that time was no longer on their side. The longer Williams and his network remained in the shadows, the more powerful they became. The walls were closing in, but Trump wasn't backing down. That evening, he made a public statement, preparing the groundwork for what would be the biggest scandal in modern political history. The media went wild, speculating about what he would reveal next. Trump held his cards close, knowing that the time wasn't right to reveal all the details just yet. But what Trump didn't expect was how quickly things began to spiral. The very day after his statement, a new twist emerged. A high-ranking law enforcement officer, a man who had once been one of Trump's biggest allies, publicly declared his loyalty to Williams. He called the accusations against Williams a smear campaign and suggested that Trump was manipulating the situation for personal gain. "He's trying to take down good people who've been working tirelessly to keep this country safe," the officer said in an exclusive interview, his voice filled with conviction. "This whole thing is a political stunt." Trump's jaw tightened as he watched the interview. The stakes had just gotten much higher. Hours later, Trump gathered his team once again, his expression dark and focused. "This changes everything," he said, his tone colder than before. "We knew they would fight back, but this is a calculated move. They're trying to discredit me and turn the public against me." Samantha was quick to respond. "That officer, he's one of Williams' people. This was planned." Trump's mind raced. It's not just about Williams anymore. It's about the entire system protecting itself. This officer isn't the only one with connections. There are others. We've got to figure out who's with us and who's against us. I need to know who I can trust. The coming days were filled with quiet tension. Trump's team worked tirelessly to investigate which of his allies had ties to the corrupt network, but it wasn't easy. There were whispers of betrayal in every corner, and it was becoming increasingly difficult to separate truth from deception. At the same time, the media frenzy surrounding the scandal grew. Williams' supporters were vocal, rallying behind their narrative that the corruption accusations were baseless. But the public's opinion was shifting. More and more people were starting to question the legitimacy of the system, and the pressure on the authorities was mounting. Then, just when it seemed that the situation was about to reach its breaking point, Trump received an unexpected call. "Mr. Trump," the voice on the other end of the line said, "I have information that could change everything." Trump's heart skipped a beat. "Who is this?" "It doesn't matter who I am," the voice replied cryptically. "What matters is what I know. Williams is planning a final move, a move that could bring everything crashing down. If you want to stop him, you need to act fast." Trump's pulse quickened. What's the move? Meet me at the old warehouse by the docks tomorrow night. I'll tell you everything. But you have to come alone. The line went dead. Trump's mind raced as he processed the phone call. It was a risk, meeting with an anonymous source, but if this person had the information he needed, it could be the break they had been waiting for. But there was a catch. Going alone was dangerous. If this was a trap, it would be the end of everything. Still, Trump couldn't afford to miss this opportunity. The next night, under the cover of darkness, Trump made his way to the warehouse. His heart pounded in his chest as he approached the location, his instincts on high alert. The place was abandoned, its windows shattered, the air thick with the smell of salt and rust. He stepped inside, the sound of his footsteps echoing in the silence. A figure emerged from the shadows, dressed in a long coat, their face obscured. "You came alone," the person said, their voice muffled by the darkness. Trump's hand hovered near his side, ready for anything. "I'm here. What do you know?" The figure stepped closer, pulling a folder from inside their coat and tossing it toward Trump. "This will tell you everything you need to know about Williams and the people he's working with. You'll find a name in there, someone you never expected." Trump grabbed the folder and flipped it open, his eyes scanning the contents. His breath caught in his throat as he saw the name, one of his closest allies. Trump's hands shook slightly as he stared at the name in the folder. It was impossible. He had trusted this person for years, worked alongside them, shared confidential plans, and even depended on their counsel during crucial moments. But now, in black and white, there it was, the name of someone in his inner circle listed as a direct contact for Williams' network. He closed the folder with a snap, his mind racing. The betrayal cut deeper than anything he had ever experienced. This wasn't just an enemy, it was a member of his team, someone who had access to all his strategies, his weaknesses. How long had they been playing both sides? How much damage had they caused in secret? "Who is it?" Samantha's voice broke through his thoughts. She had been watching him closely from the shadows, her figure outlined in the dim light of the warehouse. Her tone was cautious, but filled with an unspoken urgency. Trump didn't answer right away. He didn't need to. He handed her the folder, his expression tight with anger and disbelief. Samantha skimmed the documents, her brow furrowing. "No way," she muttered, shaking her head. "This can't be real." But the evidence was undeniable. The person listed in the file had been in frequent contact with several key figures within Williams' operation. There were phone calls, emails, even secret meetings documented over the last several months. It was clear that this was no coincidence. Trump's voice was low but seething. "This is it. This is how they've been able to stay one step ahead. We've had a mole in our camp this entire time." Samantha handed the folder back to him, her face pale. "What do we do now? If we confront them, they'll just deny everything. They'll turn the tables on us and accuse us of fabricating evidence." Trump's mind raced, and then a dangerous thought crossed his mind. "We don't confront them, not yet. We have to play this smart. This person thinks they're untouchable, but they're not. I'll get to the bottom of this, and when I do, I'll make sure everyone knows who the real enemy is." The next morning, Trump summoned a private meeting with his closest and most trusted advisors. The atmosphere in the room was heavy as he laid out the information they had discovered. Everyone in the room was stunned. The person they had all trusted, the one who had been integral to their plans, was now revealed to be part of the very conspiracy they had been fighting against. "This is a serious blow," Trump said, his voice cold and deliberate. "But we need to handle this carefully. One wrong move, and this mole could destroy everything we've worked for." He looked around at his team, his gaze piercing. "I want to know who has had direct contact with this person. I need names, dates, everything. We're going to draw them out, make them think they're still in control, but we need to keep our guard up at all times." Samantha spoke up, her voice steady. "We need to gather more evidence. This mole might have planted other pieces of misinformation or sabotage. We can't just go off one source, especially one this damning." Trump nodded. "Agreed. But we're running out of time. Williams is making his move, and we can't afford to be blind to any more surprises. This person has been playing us, and we need to make sure no one else can do the same." As the day wore on, Trump's paranoia grew. The walls felt like they were closing in. He couldn't trust anyone. Every person around him was now a potential threat. He found himself replaying every conversation, every meeting, every interaction he had with the betrayer. Were there signs he had missed? Could he have seen this coming? Meanwhile, Samantha worked tirelessly behind the scenes, digging into the mole's past interactions, following every lead. Every conversation, every coded email, every suspicious movement, they were all being traced. It was a race against time to gather enough proof to confront the traitor and take them down without risking the collapse of everything they had built. But the more Samantha uncovered, the more dangerous the situation became. It turned out that the mole wasn't just a passive participant in Williams' scheme. They were an integral part of it, feeding information that allowed Williams' network to move undetected. They had been orchestrating events from within Trump's own ranks. The deeper they dug, the more horrifying the discovery became. The mole wasn't just involved with Williams. They were also working with other powerful figures in Washington. The network they had infiltrated was far broader than anyone could have anticipated, with tentacles reaching into the very heart of the government. It was no longer just about taking down Williams. This was about exposing an entire system of corruption, one that stretched far beyond a single person or organization. Late one evening, as Trump sat alone in his office, a knock at the door broke his concentration. He looked up to see Samantha standing there, her face pale. In her hand, she held a small flash drive. "I have something," she said, her voice strained. Trump's heart sank. He had a bad feeling about this. "What is it?" Samantha handed him the drive, her eyes flickering with concern. It's the final piece. The mole's last communication with Williams. "It's bigger than we thought, Trump." Trump inserted the drive into his computer, his hands trembling slightly as the files loaded. As the documents appeared on the screen, his eyes widened in disbelief. The plot was even more elaborate than they had imagined. The mole had not only been feeding Williams information, they had also been orchestrating a plan to discredit Trump completely. There were plans to falsify evidence, plant stories in the media, and even frame Trump for crimes he hadn't committed. The mole was working with powerful allies, pulling strings in the shadows to ensure that Trump would fall and Williams' empire would rise. "God," Trump muttered, feeling the weight of the situation crash over him. "They've been setting me up the entire time. This is it. This is how they've been planning to take us down." Samantha's face hardened. "We need to act, and we need to do it fast. The mole has already started moving their pieces into place. If we don't expose them now, it could be too late." Trump sat back in his chair, his mind racing. He had always prided himself on being able to control the situation, but now, everything was spiraling out of his grasp. The enemy wasn't just outside. There were traitors within his own ranks. But if anyone could turn the tables, it was him. He had dealt with betrayal before, and he would do it again. "We move tomorrow," Trump said, his voice low but filled with resolve. "We'll expose this mole, and we'll make sure everyone knows the truth. But we do it on our terms." Samantha nodded, her expression steely. "Let's take them down." As Trump prepared for the next phase of his plan, he couldn't shake the feeling that the battle was far from over. The corruption went deeper than he could have imagined, and with each passing day, the enemy seemed to be closing in. But he had no choice now but to keep fighting. The stakes were too high, and the people counting on him were too many. Trump stood up, his resolve hardening. "We're going to take down the system. It's time to fight fire with fire." The night was quiet, too quiet for Trump's liking. The stillness was broken only by the sound of his footsteps as he paced the length of his office. His mind raced, each thought moving faster than the last. He had prepared for many things in his life, but never had he faced a betrayal so deep, so personal. The mole, someone he had trusted, had nearly destroyed everything he had built. The information Samantha had uncovered was damning, but it wasn't enough to move against them just yet. The final pieces of the puzzle were still shifting, and Trump couldn't afford to make a misstep. "We have to make the final move tonight," Trump said to Samantha, his voice low and resolute. "I've been thinking it over, and I can't wait any longer. We have everything we need to expose this person. We do it now, before they can make their next move." Samantha, who had been quiet for a while, nodded slowly. "You're right. If we wait, They'll slip away again, and we'll lose our window of opportunity. But it's dangerous. We can't underestimate what they're capable of. Trump met her gaze with a fierce determination. I've been in more dangerous situations than this. We expose them, and we take control of the narrative. We can't let them frame this story. It's time to turn the tables. That evening, as the sun set, a team of trusted operatives set to work. They worked quickly and quietly, placing hidden cameras in strategic locations, intercepting communications, and preparing the documents that would lay everything bare. Samantha worked with the team to ensure that the mole's involvement in the larger conspiracy would be crystal clear. Trump's phone rang just as they were wrapping up preparations. It was a text from an unknown number. Don't trust anyone. You're walking into a trap. His pulse quickened, but he didn't let the warning faze him. He had come this far, and he wouldn't back down now. The trap had already been set, and he was ready to spring it. I'm going to confront them myself, Trump said to Samantha as he read the message. No one else can handle this. I'll get the truth, and we'll expose them for who they really are. Samantha hesitated, then gave him a solemn nod. Be careful. As Trump arrived at the appointed meeting spot, the familiar sense of unease began to settle in. It was an abandoned building on the outskirts of the city, one of many places used for covert operations. He'd been to this location before, but tonight, it felt different. The air was heavy with the weight of the impending confrontation. Trump stepped inside, his footsteps echoing in the empty space. He could feel eyes on him, but he couldn't see anyone. The only sound was the distant hum of city traffic outside. The silence was deafening, and the longer he stood there, the more it pressed on him. Then, a figure stepped out of the shadows. It was the mole, his face masked in a mix of defiance and arrogance. I knew you'd come alone, the mole said, his voice cold and clipped. I knew you couldn't resist. Trump narrowed his eyes. You thought you had me, didn't you? You've been playing both sides this entire time? The mole laughed darkly. It was never about you, Trump. It was about power. I never wanted to work with you. I wanted to bring you down. And now, I have the chance to finish what I started. Trump took a step forward, his voice steady but filled with a controlled fury. You're done. The game's up. The truth is already out there. All your moves have been tracked, your communications intercepted. You can't run from this anymore. The mole's face twisted with a mix of disbelief and rage. You think you've won? You're just a pawn in a much larger game. If you expose me, you expose yourself. You'll never make it out of this alive. For a moment, Trump paused. The mole's words carried a chilling weight. Was this truly the end? Or was this just the beginning of something much worse? Then, with a swift motion, Trump reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a folder filled with evidence, the proof that would bring everything to light. I have everything I need to take you down. I'll make sure the world knows exactly who you are and what you've been doing. The mole's confidence wavered for the first time, but he wasn't about to give up so easily. You think you can stop this? You've already played into their hands. They've been watching you, Trump. They know everything you've been doing. A tense silence filled the room. For a moment, Trump's mind raced with the realization that his every move had been monitored. He wasn't just fighting the mole. He was up against an entire system that was working in the shadows, pulling strings behind the scenes. But Trump wasn't about to back down. Not now. He threw the folder onto the ground, his voice hard as stone. I'm not afraid of you or your system. I'm going to expose everything, and when the truth comes out, it won't matter who you're working for. You'll be finished. The mole stepped back, his eyes wild with panic. You don't understand. This isn't just about me or you. This is about control. They control everything, Trump. You'll never be able to take them down. Trump's mind raced. He was facing something much bigger than just one man. The mole was part of a vast and powerful network, one that could crush him if they chose to. But that was a risk he had to take. He was already in too deep to turn back now. I've already won, Trump said with quiet conviction. You've underestimated me. This ends tonight. Suddenly, the lights flickered, and the doors slammed shut with a deafening thud. Trump's heart raced as he realized that the mole's final move was about to unfold. The room filled with tension as the mole's eyes darted around, searching for an escape. But there was no escape. Trump had already planned for every contingency. The mole wasn't going anywhere. Before the mole could make his next move, the sound of sirens pierced the silence, growing louder with each passing second. Trump's operatives had moved into position. The trap was closing in. As the authorities burst into the room, the mole's expression shifted from defiance to sheer panic. He had nowhere left to run. "You're under arrest for conspiracy, corruption, and treason," one of the officers declared as they moved in to apprehend the mole. Trump stood still, watching as the man who had betrayed him was cuffed and taken away. His heart was still pounding, but it wasn't just from the adrenaline of the moment. This victory felt hollow. The battle was won, but the war wasn't over. As the authorities led the mole out of the building, Trump looked out over the city skyline, the weight of the future pressing heavily on his shoulders. This was just the beginning. The system was far from broken, and there were still enemies lurking in the shadows. But Trump knew one thing for sure. He wasn't done fighting. Not yet. The dust had barely settled from the confrontation when Trump found himself alone in his office once again. The mole had been taken into custody, but the victory didn't feel as sweet as he'd hoped. The air was thick with unresolved tension, and he couldn't shake the gnawing feeling that this wasn't the end. It was only the beginning. As the days passed, the news spread like wildfire. Headlines screamed about the shocking betrayal within Trump's inner circle. The mole's arrest made national news, but it also raised unsettling questions. How deep did this conspiracy run? Who else was involved? And most importantly, what would Trump's next move be? His phone rang just after breakfast the next morning. It was Samantha, her voice tense but controlled. "We need to talk," she said, her words heavy with urgency. Trump's heart sank. "What now?" "It's bigger than we thought, Trump. We're not dealing with just one bad apple. The mole was the tip of the iceberg. There's a network of people connected to this conspiracy, and it's not just about you anymore. This is about power, control, and influence at the highest levels." Trump leaned back in his chair, massaging his temples. "I figured as much. But who are we really up against? Who's pulling the strings?" "That's what I need to find out," Samantha replied, her voice sharp. "We're talking about people who have a hand in everything. The government, the media, the financial systems. We're not just taking down a few criminals. We're fighting an entire network that has infiltrated almost every institution." Trump exhaled sharply. "This is more than I bargained for." "I know," Samantha said, "but the sooner we figure out who's behind all of this, the sooner we can make our next move." Trump sat in silence for a moment, contemplating. It was one thing to be betrayed by a trusted ally, but it was another thing entirely to realize that the enemy was much larger and far more insidious than he had ever imagined. He had thought he was fighting for justice, for the people, but now he realized he was up against a system that had been operating in the shadows for years, maybe even decades. The phone call ended, but Trump didn't hang up. He stared at the walls of his office, his thoughts swirling. His mind flashed back to his days as a businessman. How many battles he had fought and won. How many deals he had brokered to get to where he was. But this was different. This wasn't just a battle for money or power. It was a battle for his very survival. Later that day, Trump met with his closest advisors in a secret location. The room was filled with tension, as everyone understood the gravity of the situation. They had won a small victory with the mole's capture, but the real war was just beginning. Every person in that room was on edge, knowing that at any moment, they could be next. Samantha briefed the group on what she had discovered so far. The mole was just a pawn. A few strings were pulled, and they thought they could take Trump down. But we've learned that there are bigger forces at play, people who are much harder to reach. Trump listened intently, his eyes narrowing as the pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place. Who are these people? What's their endgame? Samantha hesitated before speaking. They're the ones who control everything behind the scenes. The government, the media, the economy, they all answer to them. They're not just working to take you down, Trump. They're trying to reshape the entire system. And if we don't stop them, it'll be impossible to take back control. Trump felt a surge of anger. "I didn't get to where I am by backing down. These people won't know what hit them. We need to hit them where it hurts," one of his advisors, John, said firmly. "Exposing their connections, their lies, their manipulation. That's the only way to stop them. But we need to be careful. If we move too quickly, we risk alerting them before we're ready. Trump nodded. I get it. So, what's the next step? The next several days were filled with meticulous planning. Samantha worked tirelessly, gathering every scrap of information she could about the individuals behind the conspiracy. They followed leads, uncovered hidden financial transactions, and identified key players who were using their power to keep the system in place. Each discovery led to more questions, more tangled webs of corruption and deceit. Trump remained in the shadows, biding his time. His instincts told him that the moment of truth was coming soon. The network they were fighting was vast, but they had one advantage. They knew the truth, and they had the proof to expose it. But as the days wore on, Trump began to realize just how dangerous this war had become. The more they uncovered, the more the opposition closed ranks. There were whispers that Trump's every move was being watched, his actions scrutinized by the very people he had once considered allies. And the longer he waited, the more powerful the forces against him became. It was a quiet evening when Trump received a cryptic message. The text read, "The clock is ticking. You know what you have to do. Act fast, or everything will crumble." His heart raced as he read the message. He looked up at Samantha, who had entered the room just moments before. Her expression was serious, knowing the gravity of what this message meant. "It's time," Trump said, his voice low but resolute. "We can't wait any longer. We need to expose everything, right now. No more hiding in the shadows." Samantha met his gaze, her eyes filled with understanding. "You're right. We need to take control of the narrative before they do. Let's do this." That night, Trump's team launched a full-scale operation. They made the evidence public, releasing every piece of information they had uncovered about the conspiracy. The documents, emails, and financial records were shared with trusted journalists, who immediately began their investigation. The public response was overwhelming. News outlets scrambled to report on the scandal, covering the exposure of corruption at the highest levels of government, business, and media. The story dominated the headlines, and Trump's name was once again at the center of the national conversation. But this time, it was different. This time, Trump was not the villain. He was the one exposing the villains. As the truth spread, people began to rally behind him. Protests erupted in the streets, demanding justice. The power of the people was undeniable, and the forces behind the conspiracy could no longer ignore the growing backlash. But even as the world shifted, Trump knew that this was only the beginning. The system had been shaken, but it was not yet broken. He had made his move, but the battle was far from over. Now, it was time to finish what he had started. The fallout from Trump's latest move was instantaneous. As soon as the documents were made public, the world seemed to hold its breath. News outlets scrambled to report. The internet erupted with a mixture of shock, outrage, and intrigue. People poured into the streets, demanding accountability. But amidst the public outcry, a dark undercurrent of fear began to take shape. Trump had set the stage for something much larger than anyone had anticipated. A war for control that would touch every corner of society. For Trump, the exhilaration of exposing the conspiracy was fleeting. The victory felt hollow. He knew that while he had opened a window into the corruption that had long plagued the system, there was still so much more to uncover. The real battle, the one that would determine the fate of the nation, was just beginning. Trump sat in his office, staring out the window at the crowds below. The protests, the calls for action. It was all part of the storm he had unleashed. But with every movement, there was a counteraction. The forces behind the conspiracy were already preparing their next move, and Trump had no illusions about what they would do next. "Things are about to get much worse," Samantha said, breaking his reverie. She had been watching the news coverage with a sharp eye. "They're going to try and discredit us. They'll dig into every corner of your life, twist everything to make you the villain. We've only just begun to see the extent of their power." Trump nodded grimly. "I know, but this is what I signed up for. No turning back now." The days that followed were filled with tension. Trump's team worked around the clock to secure their position, coordinating with media outlets, building alliances, and making sure that the public would hear their side of the story. But despite their efforts, The conspiracy's influence ran deep. The media, which had once praised Trump, was now turning on him. Negative stories, leaks, and rumors flooded the airwaves. Every detail of his past was scrutinized. His business deals, his personal life, his public persona. All of it became ammunition for those who wanted to see him fall. "We need to fight back," Trump said, his voice fierce with determination. "I won't let them turn the truth into a lie." Samantha agreed. "We'll need to get ahead of the narrative. It's time to take the gloves off and expose everything. We can't let them control the conversation any longer." Trump knew that this was no longer just about politics. This was about survival. The conspiracy had infected every level of society, government, media, and finance. And now, they were fighting back, pulling every string they could to bring Trump to his knees. But Trump had always been a fighter. He had faced battles before, from bankruptcies to public scandals. What set this apart, however, was the sheer scale of the fight. His every move would be watched, analyzed, and twisted. He had to stay one step ahead. The opposition was vast, but so was his determination. He knew that if he didn't act decisively now, the forces against him would regroup and strike back with a vengeance. But this time, he wouldn't be fighting alone. Late one night, Trump gathered his closest allies for a final strategy meeting. The room was dimly lit, the weight of the situation pressing heavily on everyone. The walls were lined with maps, documents, and photos of key players in the conspiracy. Every piece of the puzzle was being carefully examined, and every move was being calculated. "We need to go on the offensive," Trump said, his voice cutting through the tension. "We've got the truth on our side, but they've got the power. We need to hit them where it hurts. Financially, politically, and personally. We're not just fighting for the truth anymore. We're fighting for everything we've built and everything we stand for." Samantha leaned forward, her eyes intense. "It's a game of attrition now. If we let up, even for a second, they'll take us down. But if we keep pushing, if we stay focused, we can win." Trump nodded. "We'll expose every last detail. We'll shine a light on the corruption, the manipulation, the greed. And we'll do it in a way that forces them to react. When they start scrambling, we'll be ready to take them out, one by one." The following weeks were a whirlwind of action. Trump and his team uncovered more layers of the conspiracy, revealing connections between corrupt politicians, business moguls, and influential media figures. They mapped out the web of influence and began to systematically dismantle it, piece by piece. The plan was to keep the pressure on, never letting up, never giving them a chance to regroup. As the revelations continued, the public's outrage grew. People rallied behind Trump, demanding accountability. The government, under pressure, began to make moves to investigate the corruption. But it wasn't enough. There were still too many powerful people involved, too many who had a stake in maintaining the status quo. Meanwhile, the conspiracy struck back. Coordinated attacks on Trump's credibility, his business ventures, and his personal life continued. Leaked documents, fabricated stories, and attempts to discredit him on every front. Each new attack was more vicious than the last. They wanted him to give up, to walk away. But Trump wasn't backing down. One night, as the storm of media attacks reached its peak, Trump found himself alone in his office. The pressure had built to an almost unbearable level. For a moment, he questioned everything. The sacrifices, the battles, the people he had trusted. But then, something inside him shifted. He remembered why he had started this fight in the first place. It wasn't about the power or the fame. It was about truth. It was about doing what was right. Trump stood, pacing the room as his mind raced. He knew that the time for playing by the rules was over. The conspiracy was no longer just a threat to him. It was a threat to the entire nation. And he was the only one who could stop it. "I've made it this far," Trump muttered to himself, "and I'm not going to stop now. If they want a war, they'll get one." With renewed resolve, Trump made a decision. He would go on the offensive like never before. He would expose every corrupt figure, every secret deal, and every lie. The time for subtlety was over. The world would know the truth, no matter the cost. As the chapter came to a close, Trump stood by the window, looking out at the city lights below. The war had only just begun, and the stakes were higher than ever. But he knew one thing for certain. There was no going back now. The weight of Trump's decision lingered in the air like a storm waiting to break. He had made his move, but now, the chessboard was set, and his next steps would determine the future. The forces against him were powerful, but his resolve was stronger. He knew they would stop at nothing to take him down, and he was ready to meet them head-on. In the days following his declaration of war, Trump's team worked with unmatched urgency. They coordinated covert operations to unearth even more secrets, looking for any information that could bring down the vast network of conspirators. There was a new sense of purpose. No longer was it just about defending his reputation or staying one step ahead. It was about dismantling the very system that had tried to destroy him. Samantha was the first to realize the extent of the conspiracy. Late one night, as she sifted through thousands of files, a breakthrough came. There was a connection, a network of offshore accounts, shadowy figures, and backroom deals that linked not only the individuals they had already exposed, but also some of the most powerful figures in the world. "Trump, this is bigger than we thought," Samantha said, her voice filled with disbelief. She walked into his office, holding a stack of papers. This goes all the way to the top. The people we're up against are untouchable, but we've found their money trail." Trump's eyes narrowed as he studied the papers. "I knew it. They think they're invincible. But the truth always finds a way out." The following week, Trump made a decision that would change everything. He would take the fight directly to those who had been pulling the strings from the shadows. He wasn't going to sit back and wait to be attacked anymore. The time had come to strike at the heart of the conspiracy. He planned a televised address that would expose everything. The truth about the hidden networks, the corrupt alliances, and the individuals behind it all. But he knew that this wouldn't be enough. He needed to take more drastic action. There was a final piece of the puzzle he had to solve. How could he make sure the public, the media, and even the opposition would be forced to pay attention? His plan needed to go beyond words. It needed to hit them where it hurt most. On the day of the address, the air was thick with anticipation. News outlets from all over the world had gathered, awaiting Trump's next move. He had spent the last few days preparing himself, knowing that this speech would be unlike any he had given before. This wasn't a campaign speech. This wasn't about personal glory. This was about revealing the truth, and in doing so, reclaiming control. As he stepped in front of the cameras, the weight of the moment settled over him. His hands were steady, his eyes hard with determination. He knew this was his final gambit. The conspiracy would either fall today, or it would continue its stranglehold over the system. There would be no middle ground. "Ladies and gentlemen," Trump began, his voice calm but commanding, "Today, I stand before you not as a former president, not as a businessman, but as a citizen who has seen the truth. A truth that is bigger than any one person, bigger than any one event. A truth that has been buried under layers of corruption, deceit, and manipulation for far too long." The room was silent as the weight of his words sank in. Trump continued, his gaze sweeping across the cameras. "For decades, there has been a powerful network operating in the shadows, controlling governments, manipulating economies, and twisting the media to fit their agenda. They believed they were untouchable. But today that changes. I have the proof. I have the documents, the connections, and the names of those who have betrayed the public trust." As Trump outlined the details of the conspiracy, the world watched in disbelief. Names were named, secret deals exposed, and the true extent of the corruption was laid bare for all to see. His team had worked tirelessly to gather this information, and now the truth was out. But Trump wasn't done yet. "We have not only exposed these individuals," he said, his voice rising with intensity, "but we have the power to take them down. I'm not going to sit here and let them continue to control this country. We will not rest until every last one of them is held accountable." In the wake of Trump's speech, the world seemed to shudder. The media exploded with coverage, and public opinion began to shift. What had once been a story about a billionaire fighting for survival had turned into a full-blown revolution. People rallied behind Trump, demanding justice. The pressure on the government mounted as politicians scrambled to distance themselves from the exposed conspirators. But just as quickly as Trump's supporters grew in numbers, so too did the backlash. The conspiracy had deep roots. and those who were exposed were not about to go down without a fight. Within hours, counterattacks began. Leaked documents, disinformation campaigns, and vicious media attacks flooded the airwaves. Trump's past was scrutinized again, his every move dissected. Samantha, ever vigilant, observed the pattern. They're trying to drown us in noise. They want to confuse the public, make them question everything. Trump didn't flinch. Let them. They think they can control the narrative. They're wrong. In the days that followed, Trump's legal team filed a series of lawsuits aimed at the conspirators. The goal wasn't just to bring them to court. It was to create an overwhelming pressure that would force them to face the truth. But the conspiracy's reach was vast, and as Trump's team uncovered more, they realized that they weren't just fighting a few corrupt individuals, they were fighting an entire system. "We need to go public with everything," Samantha said, her tone fierce. "The more we expose, the more powerful our position becomes. We can't let them win." Trump nodded. "We'll keep pushing. We won't stop until the system is completely broken. If we have to tear it all down to rebuild it, then so be it." As the weeks turned into months, the battle intensified. Trump's team, now fully aware of the scale of the war they were in, ramped up their efforts. Every day brought new revelations, new enemies, and new allies. The conspiracy's grip on the world began to loosen as more and more powerful figures were dragged into the light. With each move, Trump grew more confident. But in the back of his mind, Trump knew the ultimate challenge still lay ahead. The conspiracy wasn't just going to roll over. They had their own plans, and those plans were far more dangerous than anything he had encountered so far. As the stage was set for the final showdown, Trump knew that this would be the ultimate test of his strength, his resolve, and his ability to navigate the treacherous waters of power. The stage was set. The conspiracy had been exposed, but it was far from over. Trump knew the real battle was about to begin. The forces against him had been weakened, but their power still lingered in the shadows. The exposure of their corrupt dealings had rattled their foundations, but the fight was far from won. The public was on edge, divided between those who stood with Trump and those who still questioned the validity of the revelations. The conspiracy wasn't just about people pulling strings. It was a machine deeply embedded in every layer of society. And now, it was pushing back with everything it had. In the aftermath of Trump's explosive televised address, the world seemed to be in a state of chaotic uncertainty. Protests erupted in major cities around the world, as people either rallied behind him or took to the streets to protest what they believed were fabricated claims. The global economy wavered, stock markets fluctuated wildly, and governments scrambled to respond. Inside his inner circle, Trump's team knew this was a turning point. They had to go on the offense, keep the pressure up, and strike while the iron was hot. The conspiracy was resilient, but so was Trump's resolve. "Trump, we've uncovered the final piece," Samantha said, walking into his office with a determined look. She placed a thick stack of documents in front of him. "This is the key. We've been looking for it all along. The master file, the names that lead to the very top." Trump leaned forward, scanning the documents with a sharp gaze. "This is it. These names, these connections, will finish them. It's time to bring down the whole house of cards." But as Trump prepared to make his next move, he felt the weight of the battle pressing on him. The conspiracy had been clever, weaving itself into every corner of politics, business, and media. And now, as their plan to discredit him failed, they resorted to even more desperate tactics. Late one evening, Trump received an unexpected call. It was from an old friend, one he hadn't spoken to in years. "Donald, it's John." The voice on the other end said, urgency in his tone. "I have information. They know you're coming for them. They've already started moving against you. It's bigger than you realize." Trump's heart skipped a beat. "What do you mean? What's going on?" "They've got plans," John continued. "Plans to take you down. You've been playing their game, but they've been playing you too. I don't think you fully understand the depths of their reach. It's now or never. You've got one chance to end this, but it'll require everything you have." Trump's mind raced. He knew the stakes were high, but now, more than ever, he realized just how dangerous the conspiracy was. The time for half measures was over. He had to go all in. The next morning, Trump gathered his team for an urgent strategy meeting. Samantha, his closest allies, and his legal team all sat around the table, their faces grim. "We're on the brink of something big," Trump said, his voice steady but intense. "This is it. We have the final pieces of the puzzle. The conspiracy thinks they can win, but they've underestimated me. We're going to expose them once and for all." Samantha nodded. "We need to move fast. If we wait too long, they'll bury us. We need to hit them with everything we've got." The plan was simple. They would release the final files, containing the names of the top figures in the conspiracy, and launch an all-out media blitz. They would take control of the narrative and force the corrupt figures to face the consequences of their actions. The truth would no longer be optional. It would be undeniable. The night before the files were set to be released, Trump sat in his office, reflecting on everything that had led to this moment. The journey had been long and difficult. He had faced ridicule, betrayal, and a constant onslaught of attacks. But through it all, he had held on to one core belief, that the truth, no matter how inconvenient, would always rise to the surface. His phone rang, pulling him from his thoughts. It was a message from an anonymous source, a final warning. "Be careful. They are preparing to make their move. You don't have much time." Trump's heart raced. The message was clear. The conspiracy wasn't going down without a fight. They were preparing for something even more dangerous, something that could stop him in his tracks. "Now's not the time to hesitate," Trump muttered to himself. He grabbed the final documents and handed them to Samantha. "It's go time." The next day, as the files went public, the world held its breath. The names, the connections, the hidden deals, all of it was laid bare for everyone to see. News outlets around the world exploded with breaking stories. The conspiracy had been exposed for what it truly was, a web of corruption that spanned across continents, involving some of the most powerful people in the world. But the reaction was swift. The conspiracy's allies in high places began to strike back immediately. A coordinated media campaign began to spread disinformation, accusing Trump of being the mastermind behind the entire plot. Fake news stories flooded the airwaves, attempting to twist the narrative and discredit the files. But Trump was ready. The public had seen the truth, and no amount of lies could erase what had been exposed. As the battle for control raged on, Trump knew the final test was coming. The conspiracy wasn't going to fade quietly. Their last-ditch effort would be to use everything in their power, media manipulation, political influence, even violence, to stop him. Late one evening, as Trump reviewed his final strategy, his phone buzzed. It was an urgent message from his security team. "They're coming for you. You need to get out now." Trump froze. The message was clear. The conspiracy was ready to make their final move. But Trump wasn't one to back down. Not now. Not ever. In the final moments, as the walls closed in around him, Trump made a decision that would define his legacy. He would face the conspiracy head-on, no matter the cost. The conspiracy had underestimated him from the start. Now, the tables were about to turn. The tension in the air was palpable. Trump's final move had been set in motion, and every second felt like it could be his last. The conspiracy, now fully aware of how close they were to total exposure, was preparing for their own retaliation. They had already used every weapon in their arsenal to discredit Trump, but their attacks hadn't been enough. The truth was out, and there was no turning back. But even with the public rallying behind him, Trump knew that the forces he was up against were unlike anything he had faced before. These weren't just corrupt politicians or businessmen. They were part of a far-reaching system, a web that had been woven over decades, and they would stop at nothing to preserve their power. Trump couldn't let his guard down, not for a second. As Trump prepared for the next phase, he was once again pulled into a late-night strategy meeting with his closest allies. Samantha, his legal team, and a few trusted former allies were all gathered in a secure location, their faces tense but determined. "We need to be one step ahead of them," Samantha said, her voice low and urgent. "They've got resources, but we've got the truth. If we can get ahead of the media narrative, we can cripple their response." Trump nodded. "We've exposed them, but now we need to finish it. This isn't just about taking down a few bad apples. This is about dismantling an entire system. If we don't act quickly, they'll find a way to suppress it, to make this all go away." His eyes hardened. "I'm ready to fight fire with fire." The following days were a whirlwind of strategy, media blitzes, and legal maneuvers. Trump's team filed multiple lawsuits, each one aimed at exposing a different layer of the conspiracy. The more they dug, the more they uncovered. Hidden accounts, backroom deals, bribery schemes, and even a trail of violence that led back to some of the most powerful names in the world. The documents they had collected were a roadmap of corruption that stretched across borders, and now, it was all coming to a head. But Trump was aware that this wasn't just about legal victories or media exposure. The real battle would be fought in the court of public opinion. As more and more information came to light, the global media machine shifted into overdrive. News stations from all over the world picked up the story, but as expected, the conspiracy's allies in the media worked tirelessly to paint Trump as the villain. Fake reports flooded the internet, accusing him of being a part of the very conspiracy he had worked so hard to expose. Despite the pushback, Trump remained resolute. His team pushed forward, using the truth as their weapon. And then, a breakthrough came. A key piece of evidence emerged. An insider from within the conspiracy had come forward with a direct connection to one of the top figures. This was the final link that could bring everything crashing down. Samantha was the first to break the news. She burst into Trump's office, holding a small flash drive with a gleam of triumph in her eyes. "Trump, this is it," she said breathlessly. "We've got them. This video, it's the smoking gun we needed. It's all on tape." Trump's pulse quickened. "Show me." Samantha plugged the flash drive into a laptop and pulled up the video. On the screen was a high-profile government official, one of the last untouchable figures in the conspiracy, meeting with several shadowy figures in a private meeting. They discussed the manipulation of global economies, rigging elections, and silencing whistleblowers. Everything that Trump had been trying to expose. The official spoke with a calm, chilling confidence, showing no fear of getting caught. It was clear that they thought they were untouchable. "This is it," Trump said, his voice filled with resolve. "We release this, and it's over. The world will know who these people really are." The decision was made. They would release the video to the public, but Trump knew the stakes were higher than ever. If they went public with this, there would be no going back. The conspiracy would fight back with everything they had: legal threats, attacks on Trump's credibility, and even more disinformation. But Trump was done playing by their rules. The world watched in shock as the video hit the airwaves. News stations immediately picked it up, broadcasting it across every channel. The fallout was immediate and explosive. The official, once seen as a pillar of the establishment, was now the face of the conspiracy, and the video made it clear just how deep the corruption ran. The public was outraged. The truth had finally come out. But with every revelation, the conspiracy's retaliation grew more desperate. The video, though damning, was only the beginning. As expected, the corrupted power structures began to crumble. The media machine that had once been their greatest ally turned on them as the scandal spiraled out of control. Public figures who had once been untouchable were now being dragged through the mud. Trump watched as the pieces fell into place. But there was a new urgency in his movements. The conspiracy wasn't finished. They still had one last trick up their sleeve. That night, as Trump sat in his office, reviewing the news coverage, his phone buzzed. It was a message from an anonymous source. "They've just activated the final phase. You're the target now." Trump's heart raced. He knew what that meant. The conspiracy had one last play. They would go after him directly. They would stop at nothing to bring him down. Trump's security team was immediately on high alert. But as they worked to protect him, Trump felt a sudden sense of clarity. This was the moment where everything he had worked for would come to a head. The conspiracy had underestimated him at every turn, and now they were about to feel the full force of his resolve. He stood up, his mind clear. "I'm not going to run. They can't win." With the final pieces of the puzzle in place, Trump knew the endgame was near. The conspiracy had tried to outsmart him, but now they had nowhere left to hide. The truth had won, and with it, Trump had claimed victory, not just for himself, but for the millions of people who had stood with him through this fight. As the conspiracy crumbled, Trump stood tall, knowing that the world had been forever changed. The battle was over, and the truth had triumphed. The battle was finally over. The dust was settling, but the world was forever changed. The conspiracy that had once seemed untouchable was now nothing more than a distant memory, a collection of exposed lies and broken power structures. Trump had emerged victorious, but the cost had been high. The war wasn't just fought in courts or through media. It had been a battle for truth, for freedom, and for the very soul of a fractured society. As the final remnants of the conspiracy crumbled, Trump found himself at a crossroads. He had won, but the victory felt hollow. The battle for justice had come at a steep price, not just to his reputation, but to his own understanding of the world around him. Every victory had been shadowed by the deep toll it had taken on his personal life, his relationships, and even his own sense of trust in the people around him. In the months that followed, Trump withdrew from the public eye. It wasn't a defeat, not by any means, but it was a retreat, a chance to reflect on everything that had happened. Samantha and his closest advisors had tried to keep him engaged in rebuilding efforts, but Trump needed time to process the enormity of what he had just lived through. It had been a whirlwind, a shocking expose of the darkest parts of power. But now that the world knew the truth, the questions loomed larger than ever. What now? What kind of legacy would he leave behind? And what had he really accomplished? One quiet afternoon, Trump found himself walking alone on the grounds of his private estate. The weight of his decisions hung heavy in the air as he gazed out across the landscape. It had always been about power, success, and winning for him. But now, for the first time, he was questioning what that truly meant. He had exposed the corruption at the highest levels. He had shattered an intricate web of deceit and manipulation. Yet, as the dust settled, the world around him seemed to be shifting into a new kind of uncertainty. The battle was won, but what was the world like after the truth had been laid bare? As he sat on a bench, contemplating everything, Samantha joined him. She had been a steadfast ally throughout the entire ordeal, and her presence was a reminder that, despite everything, he wasn't alone in this. "You did it," Samantha said softly, sitting down next to him. "You changed the course of history." Trump glanced over at her. But at what cost? What did it all mean? She looked him in the eye, her gaze firm and understanding. "You stood up against a system that was broken, a system that never cared about the truth. It wasn't just about you or me. It was about something bigger, something that needed to be exposed." Trump nodded slowly, taking in her words. "I always thought I was in this for the win, the power. But maybe it wasn't about that at all. Maybe it was about something more, something that goes beyond what any of us ever imagined." Months passed, and the fallout from the conspiracy's collapse began to shape a new world. The global political landscape was reshaped, as leaders who had been part of the corruption were ousted, and new faces emerged, promising transparency and reform. But the damage had been done. Trust was in short supply, and while the truth had won the day, the future was uncertain. Trump's legacy was a mixed one. To some, he was a hero, someone who had fought for the truth and defeated a system that had long been rotten. To others, he was a disruptor, a figure who had shaken up the status quo, whether people liked it or not. But as Trump looked back on his journey, he realized one undeniable truth. He had changed the world, for better or worse. He had exposed the corrupt forces that had ruled from the shadows, and in doing so, he had forever altered the way people viewed power, politics, and trust. In the final moments of the story, Trump stood before a crowd, his first public appearance in months. The air was thick with anticipation. People had gathered to hear what he had to say, to hear how he would define his victory. Would it be a victory speech? A reflection on the journey? The crowd went silent as he took the stage, his familiar presence now more reflective than ever. "My fellow Americans," Trump began, his voice steady but thoughtful, "this fight wasn't just mine. It was all of ours. We've exposed the corruption that is hidden in the shadows for far too long, and we've shown that no one, no matter how powerful, is above the truth. But the real work starts now." He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. "This victory is not the end. It's just the beginning. We have a chance to rebuild, to restore integrity, transparency, and justice. We must stand together, not just as a country, but as a world that believes in the power of truth. The road ahead won't be easy, but if we stay united, we can create something better." Trump looked out at the crowd, seeing a mix of faces, some hopeful, some skeptical. This fight isn't over. It's never over. We must continue to hold ourselves accountable and ensure that no one ever takes the power of the people for granted again. As the crowd erupted into applause, Trump felt a sense of peace. The journey had been long, and the battle had been hard-fought. But in the end, it wasn't about one person or one victory. It was about the truth and the power it held to change the world.